All right. I'm sure everybody sort of sees the beginnings of that. Hi guys, welcome to another live stream, another episode of Audiophiles Anonymous. And for this week, we have the wonderful Grover Neville, the very well known at this point within the audio community. He's now
Wow.
working with Audeze, but actually, I wanted to start off sort of just by asking you, what's for those who are unaware, what's sort of your background in, I guess, the headphone world and audio in general. And I know you from the Interfidelity days, and reading all of those articles
Yeah.
back then. But so yeah, if you could
hmm
give some sort of background on just sort of who you are and what got you to the place that you're at now.
Yeah. I'm going to just start at the beginning and run through it real quick. So I was 13, I think, 12 or 13. And I had a pair of Skull Candy headphones that had just broken. And this sounds like such a cliche. My dad was an audiophile. He had old Vandersteens and things like that when I was a kid. And I kind of knew about it, but he would always try and sit me down and listen. It was cool, but like, I was kind of like, yeah, whatever, Dad. And then one of my uncles gave me a pair of Skull Candies that I mostly used to play my digital piano when I was in middle school. And when those broke, I went on a search for a new pair, and that was kind of how I got into headphones, moving from like scuffling through stuff at Best Buy and thinking like, the more I listen to this stuff, the more it doesn't sound that great. And then discovering, a pair of Sennheisers, like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then, I think I was I was like 13 or just early 14 when I went to my first Headphone meet, which was in Chicago. Jude was there. Ray Samuels was there. He brought like 3 Lamborghinis. It was one of the old classic, for people who remember the old Headphone meets, like one of the big old cool Chicago meets. That was a huge deal. Those were like our mini conventions. There was like 100 people there.
Yeah.
I was blown away, and I was like, I was this little 13-year-old kid. I didn't know anything. I was super interested in all this. So after a couple of years, high school, college, whatever, kind of saving up money here and there, buying headphones, things like that. Went to music school. I got a gig with Interfidelity. Actually, Tile was the one who hired me originally. And Tile had originally hired me to do measurements
Oh,
for
interesting.
Interfidelity because he needed someone to do the measuring. And then after that, he was like, well, hey, do you want to do writing? Can you write? And I was like, well, I actually had a creative writing major as well as my music degree. So yeah, I'd love to do some writing. So we talked about it, and we did some writing, and he would hand me some products and things like that. It was mostly electronics, mostly amplifiers and things like that, and DACs, because he would do obviously most of the full size headphones, IEMs, stuff like that was all things that I would do. And then, Tile, of course, departed Interfidelity, and they brought Rafe on from, I believe he was at PTA, or he was running AudioStream actually at that time, and they put Rafe in charge of Interfidelity.
Mm-hmm.
And Rafe, that was kind of, in the Stereophile group, running a single publication is a big, responsibility. So he was tasked with running AudioStream and Interfidelity, which was just too much. One person can't do that much work. So he kind of passed it off to me, and that was sort of the couple of months where I had become essentially the de facto dude at Interfidelity. And then Rafe departed, and Interfidelity, kind of had designs to, well, I was the only person there, right? So I was essentially running the site. And I departed actually not too long after that, because I got an offer of employment from Audeze, which was, well, just to be frank, paid better and was more interesting to do. So that's how I moved from the,
Right.
From the altruistic side of reviewing to the evil, skeezy manufacturer side.
No.
Just kidding. But no, so Audeze, actually, I had talked to at NAMM, and actually, some people may remember I did some work for Shit actually before Interfidelity.
Yeah.
So there was
I think what
a little bit of stuff that I did there. It was mostly. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think when I it was sort of Googling your official position at Audeze, a bunch of stuff from Shit Audio showed up, and I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Did I get this wrong?
I was actually with them probably for the longest, for
Yeah.
2 or 3 years. I eventually kind of was in charge of customer support at one point.
Okay.
Before I left, and then And that was very amicable. I still love those guys, and wonderful product, wonderful, relationship with them. They make great stuff. And so then, let's see. Yeah. So then I met Audeze. I mean, I knew Sankar and Jaren a little bit before, just from being in the community, but I never owned Audeze headphones. And I met them at NAMM, actually, which is a professional music convention in January 2019. And they had said, we're looking for someone to do social and video and stuff like that. We really want to up our game in that department. And we want to kind of improve our branding and have someone who can communicate with the customers, be interface with the community more, because we, haven't had the bandwidth to do that. So fast forward again, and I think June or July, I had been doing part-time work for Audeze, and they said, "Hey, we're making this a full-time position. Would you be interested?" I said yes. So I've been with them since about full-time. It's been August or September, I think. So it's only been a couple months. It's still a relatively new position. And yeah, so if you see anything on the Audeze social, YouTube pages, things like that, Twitch, that's all kind of stuff that I have a hand in. So, and that role is continuing to expand as we have, all sorts of interesting, fun, exciting new stuff coming up. That's something that I'm getting handed more and more responsibility with. So that's kind of how I ended up at Audeze. This is sort of, I guess, 11 or 12 years for me that the hi-fi journey has really started. And it's kind of, I never expected that it would end up working for a manufacturer of headphone gear. Certainly not one like, that's as well known as Audeze or anything like that. That wasn't something I ever imagined being able to do. But, certainly not when I was like 13 or 14. But here I am. So it's like I said, to me, in my mind, it's kind of been like the culmination of like a 10 to 12 year journey. I'm 25 now. So I've been around the block on Headphone and things like that. But, but yeah, that's kind of how I ended up at Audeze. That's just a short, quick and dirty summary of who I am. In terms of, the background, I'm a musician. I play keyboards, I sing, I play, brass wind instruments. I went to Oberlin Conservatory. I did a lot of studio recording as well as performance stuff. Big music theory nerd. I work also on the side in the film and music post-production industries. I do some work with some pretty well-known mastering engineers on some pretty cool records. And I do, film sound mixing. I do composing for video games and film. So I have lots of musical life, outside of hi-fi. But hi-fi has always been a passion for me. And now I have, a stereo system at home, as well as headphone gigs and all sorts of other stuff like that. So, yeah. And I have, too many interests, but that's kind of a little bit about me. So
it's always how it goes. So it's funny, you started young with this stuff, and it's great to see that it's gotten you to this point, and it's an interesting trajectory to follow, I suppose. But actually, I wanted to ask, I mean, are you still at all in contact with Tile? Have you heard from him at all since he went off in his van thing?
So I actually don't hear from him super often. Last I heard, actually, I heard from, I don't know if you know Brian Hunter at Audiohead. No, I don't. But I was chatting with him, and he was actually pretty good friends with Tile. And Tile, I don't know how many people know this, but he basically packed his life up into a van and just roams the country, and has, he at one point had this crazy huge PA system, and he had this auditory experience thing that you would like walk through and be immersed in all this interesting sounds. And it was kind of an interesting avant-garde artistic experience. But yeah, I think he's, last I heard, he was still healthy and doing, reasonably well. And I mean, living in a van, roaming the country, kind of very free form. So that's about what I know.
As far as the I don't know if you could talk about this, but the time when Rafe took over Interfidelity, I think there were a lot of people in the headphone community who were just sort of wondering like what's going on with the measurements. And so there was a lot of question marks surrounding like, as soon as I guess Stereophile brought Rafe in, those measurements are like, they kind of went away, right? So I guess the question is like, do you have any insight into what went on there, or is that something you could talk about?
So yeah, I mean, I never signed any NDAs.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I'll do my best to
Yeah.
to make everybody look,
Yeah.
look good. But essentially, and the other thing too is I didn't have necessarily the deepest understanding, because the thing about when I worked at the Stereophile group was there was very much like the people who ran things were kind of up in the air and sort of mysterious, and then there was a couple people who I worked with directly on just publishing things and stuff like that, but it was very mysterious to me. And I mean, I was given a fair amount of leeway in some regards, and then there were a couple hard ground rules, but they didn't really necessarily tell me a lot, right? So it wasn't like I came in and I had all this transparency. Even when Tile was there was, because that was post AV Tech Media taking over,
Right.
and so there was a lot of just like, the overlords send down their commandments, and we're like, okay. I mean, we were never really told what the logic behind any decisions was or anything like that. And I don't want to say it was bad or that we were like, this is dumb or stupid. It was just kind of like, we didn't have a lot of transparency or insight in the process. We wrote articles, we sent some stuff in, and they sent paychecks, eventually. And it was like, that was just the relationship.
Yep.
So essentially, what happened, the Tile had someone else doing the measurements at that point. And actually, someone else, I can't say who, but there is a company, pretty well known actually in the headphone realm, company that purchased Tile's rig, and they use it for their measurements. Some people in the community may know who they are, but they asked me not to say their name when they told me this. So anyways, but they have that rig, and they put it to good use, and they're wonderful guys and they make great products. So that is where that rig is now. So it's not dead. But at the time, Rafe had been pushing to get the measurements done. And there was a big problem with like Tile's rig was old and it's a bit difficult to use and it needed some updating. There were things that were broken on it. There were times when sometimes it wouldn't, it was just frustrating. You would have to redo measurements a lot. And it was an old, weird system. It used this weird old computer that was like ancient and ran on like some old DOS system. And it was, it was archaic, and as great as that was, there's always this difficulty, right? And critical, right? And you guys, I'm sure, have this as well, where it's like, cool, we have all these measurements we did in this old rig, and now B&K came out with this new head that costs a bunch of money and has totally different, compensations. It's like, well, we can't just we don't want to throw out all the old reference stuff, but we don't have to remeasure every single piece of gear we've ever measured, so that was something that was difficult. They had a guy in the UK who was going to measure stuff and had a really high-end, nice rig, and they were going to keep all the old measurements up, but then put up new measurements essentially, and kind of try and do this way. I don't know what the specific drama there was, but it didn't happen, right? One of the issues was that manufacturers would have had to send 2 pieces of gear out every time they sent gear out for review, because Rafe lived in Vancouver, I lived in Chicago, and the guy who was doing the measurements name was Keith, lived in the UK. So it was like a big shipping, hassle. But then also I think, the folks at AV Tech Media, I just don't know if they really ever understood interfidelity completely, and what it was and what we were trying to do. And I think it was kind of, they were like, why do you want measurements? And it got to the point where they finally told, Rafe and myself, like, don't talk to Keith, like, do not contact Keith. I don't know, again, I don't know what the logic was behind that. I don't want to demonize anybody, but there was something happened there. And so that kind of, despite the best efforts of Rafe and myself to try and get those measurements set up, it never happened.
That's interesting. And
that was something that both of us did push for, because we wanted it. We both understood that was an important part of the site. That was something that, I remember looking at those measurements and referencing them over the years many, many times myself. That was a tool that I used. So that was something that I was kind of sad to see fall by the wayside. But again, I don't know that necessarily anyone ever really at AV Tech Media understood what interfidelity was and what was trying to do. And so from there, it became also, they had a huge content ask. And so there were some pieces of content that I wasn't entirely happy with that we published, but their ask for the amount of content they wanted published was more than 2 people could do. It was it was enormous. And so, I think I was a little upset, but I think that in some ways, the other thing too was like, it got hard to get gear at the end. We had difficulty getting people to send us gear, and getting stuff on the docket. So it got very difficult to continue to just produce the quality content, the kinds of content. And then with the pandemic hitting, they had to let some staff go. Rafe departed, and there just wasn't support for, me to run the website by myself without any sort of team or support, without necessarily the funding that would have been needed to do that. And that was a point where I was kind of like, I was freelance at that point. So it was like, I need to pay rent. So
Yeah.
I was just,
Yeah. But
it was sink or swim kind of in a sense for a lot of people, especially people who are freelance in the entertainment industry like myself. So it was kind of one of those things where I was like, I just didn't, it didn't make sense, financial sense anymore, unfortunately. And the amount of work that they were asking for just wasn't commensurate with compensation. So
it seems like
again, I'm not saying that they paid poorly or anything like that. It was just wasn't realistic for me anymore. So that's kind of how it felt. But I was shocked to find out that they had shut the whole site down. I thought they would at least keep it up for the archives and things like that, because there were still a lot of hits and people still visited the archives frequently. And I told them, if you guys want some help finding a new person, or you want a few names, here's a few names you should get in touch with. I don't know if they ever did, but that was, that's all history now. So I think also, in a sense, nobody was ever going to be able to fill Tyle's shoes.
Right.
He was such a titan within the headphone industry, right, within the headphone hobby, that I certainly felt the pressure. It was like, crap, like I'm not Tile. I can't be Tile.
Not the same beard.
I was inspired by Tile myself. Yeah. I don't have, I haven't shaved for like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So that's my,
yeah.
That's my mom's, thanks mom. She's Asian, and it's like the miracle of the Asian hair follicle. It's just like no beards. Anyways, so there was certainly, I felt a pressure to try and live up to Tile's legacy, and it's like the granddaddy of the headphone hobby. Like nobody's gonna live up to that, So we did our best, and there were certainly some very fond memories I have of working with Tile and working with Rafe, and we had fun. It wasn't all bad stuff. Even the end wasn't bad stuff. It was just, amicable departure. But I was sad to see it go. For me, it was a piece of history, because it was a big part of my headphone experience as a kid, as a kid growing up and reading the site and paying attention to that. And, so I was sad to see it go, but I almost think, in a sense, I don't know if anybody could have really taken it over and done it justice.
I think that there was a lot of people in the community who were really sad to see it go. And it's really interesting that you point out that Rafe was pushing for measurements, and I think that there was a bit of a disconnect there with when it came to the way people saw that, because I think the public perception was something along the lines of like, there's Tile, and then we get all the measurements, and then this new guy comes in, and suddenly the reviews are not that, it's not the kind of focus that many of the I guess the enthusiasts were looking for, and it seemed like a shift in direction. But it's interesting to hear that it actually that he was pushing for trying to get measurements. It's just that this is like a and in many ways that kind of makes it like a perfect storm for if the higher ups don't understand necessarily the point of the measurements or why that's so sought after, that then it's not going to get as much traction, and then that influences the ability to get gear and all this kind of stuff. So
sorry, I'm laughing at the chat. There's some funny stuff in the chat. Also, Metal571 pointed out very accurately that you can still get the PDFs from the Wayback Machine, which is a great point. Somebody should store those on like a Wix site or something like that. Maybe I'll do that.
Does that include Tile's articles? Like his educational?
If it had saved them, because the Wayback Machine would save websites at certain dates, so it should have them saved up to whatever the most recent date is, I would think. But you're totally right. So I mean, Rafe had a different style than Tile. That is just anyone who's read his work at PTA, who follows him at Resistor Magazine nowadays, knows. I love Rafe. He's a great guy. He was always really friendly to me. I never had a problem with him. We still chat every once in a while. He has a very different style than Tile. He's a much more what some people would say lifestyle. He's a speaker guy. He's into vinyl. He's into Harbeths. He wasn't, I don't think, as much of a headphone guy when he started the website. So to me, it was a little weird, first of all, that they put him in charge of audio stream, which is digital stuff. But I think he was certainly capable of that. But then it was a little even stranger that they also kind of, and I think, again, speaking to the fact that they just didn't understand interfidelity, were like, oh yeah, headphones, whatever, throw them in the corner, toss it into Rafe's corner and let him deal with it. And Interfidelity did really good numbers at the end of Tile's peak. He was doing very good numbers. And I think, again, Rafe was never going to be Tile, but he did push for the measurements because he understood that was an important part of the site. I, at Interfidelity, kind of tried to base my reviews on the way that Tile structured them. He had a structure to his reviews that became kind of a standard for a lot of people, right? Where like introduction, build quality and finish, then page 2, sound quality. How does the sound quality relate to the measurements? And then a conclusion of like, is this headphone worth your time? What does it sound like? Does it, what does it offer? And that was kind of a structure. I think I noticed that was a thing that he started, and a lot of people do that now because it's a great format for reviews, right? As opposed to, again, someone like Rafe, who tends to write reviews more as like this sort of holistic story that's not always linear, and that makes for great fiction. And it really works for the kind of stories that he tells at Resistor, where it's like very much like this Japanese, this crazy Japanese guy who has these weird horn speakers and has this crazy vinyl collection and these interesting, there's sort of flavor stories, more than like Tile was very much like hardcore measurements and how does what I'm seeing on the graph coordinate with what I'm hearing. So it was a different style, certainly. I think it probably could have worked if there, continued to be measurements. That's just my opinion. But yeah, he wasn't, he wasn't deaf to what the community was saying. We read the comments and we knew what people wanted and were saying. But it was kind of one of those situations where it's like, well, the higher ups say that we can't, don't talk about this, don't say anything about it. And it's like, at the end of the day, like, we are getting a paycheck from them, know? And it wasn't like enormous amounts of money. Like, reviewers aren't, this, right? Reviewers don't get massive amounts of money to say nice things about products. But and certainly if you want to make money, hi-fi is not the realm to do it in. If you want to make money being dishonest, there are way easier places to do it, like the stock market. But yeah, it was just one of those things where it was like, well, we can't, what I wanted to say to the community was like, we're trying, we really are honestly trying to do this right for you guys. And for reasons that, like we're not being worked with, like the folks are not working with us, and we don't know why.
Right.
So we really didn't have anything good to tell you guys. So it was like, it was kind of like damage control. It was like, well, what do we say? It was like, we don't have anything to say other than like, we're trying. But that just sounds stupid, right? When you say like, we're working on it, and people are like, cool, you've been saying you're working on it for 6 months. Where are the fucking measurements?
Sorry. No. By all means, this is
okay. Cool.
This is the more unfiltered live stream.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I was frustrated. I was very frustrated by that, right? So yeah, I mean, I was upset by it.
Tyler's drinking already, by the way.
Oh yeah.
By the way, I don't know if I've introduced you guys yet, and welcome Tyler to the stream. I think you're muted, Tyler.
Yeah, I was muted.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thanks for stopping by, Metal. It's good to see you.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I hope
cheers, Metal.
In the chat.
That thing has been a giant pain in my butt today.
See, we all have that thing.
Yeah, we've all got the Cam Link.
I had to switch to my ATEM Mini just to get it to work, because the Cam Link it gets super finicky with different hubs, USB hubs. So
yeah, I noticed that too. If I plug it in directly on my computer, it works a lot better. But the hubs sometimes it gets a little.
So that my understanding with that is that the initially when you plug it in, it goes into bulk collection mode or something like that. Yeah, and that doesn't always work with the port. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It depends somewhat on what SLR, like if you're using an SLR, it depends somewhat on what camera you're using. I actually find that like my Sonys work great with it because the Sonys are very, digital in nature, but they also have some cameras, especially older ones, or some of the Canons sometimes, the lenses, like the focus on the lenses, if it's done, digitally, they tweak out with the Cam Link. Even on manual focus, they're like, what is this crazy, thing? So it's a little hit and miss sometimes.
As Tyler's getting his setup going here, just get the mic right in the shot. That's perfect.
Perfect.
Also, hi, Elnric. It's really good to see you, and I hope you're doing well. We should catch up sometime.
All right, so I guess moving on to the Audeze stuff. Actually, before we get to that, you've said some interesting stuff about digital audio, and so, for example, I'm thinking of you were talking just like a couple weeks ago, I think, about how when doing EQ, it's better to, like, in theory, it's better to cut than it is to boost and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is something that,
And sorry, just was this in relation to like the Reveal Plus stuff, or was it in relation to like?
it's just in general.
Oh, in general.
Just
Okay.
anytime you do EQ, my take on it is it's always better to cut than to boost. That's something that a lot of production people will talk about in music, like mixing, mastering, post-production, things like that. Because in the analog realm, and this is partially delivery format. So when you had vinyl as the primary format for listening to music, engineers were actually taught to boost the treble a little bit at every stage of the process. So on the mix console, you would boost the treble on the channel strip at every step along the way. And then when you maybe had outboard gear, compressor, or master bus, you would boost the treble just a little bit. And then when it would get to the cutting house, the mastering engineer would boost the treble just a little bit. Because what happens during the RIA curve is the bass gets brought down so that the cutter head, which is a very small needle that cuts the vinyl, can actually cut it. If you have a huge bass, it's not going to be able to cut it as well. So what they do is they take the bass way down with the RIA curve, and then they boost it back up in the phono stage, right?
Right.
So your records have very little bass on them. The phono stage boosts that bass back up to where it's supposed to be, right? But there's a bump. There's what's called a head bump from the cutter head. And so it causes a 50 hertz bass hump, which is part of why vinyl sounds big and bassy and has huge bass and is like really fun to listen to, right? And then the RIA curve also has a treble boost, right? And so the way that these treble boosts and bass cuts work, every engineer, you would lose a little bit of analog fidelity in the treble region at every step along the way, because analog gear is a little bit lossy in the treble, right? So you would boost it and boost it and boost it. And so by the time you got to your record, you wanted to make sure the record sounded bright enough and wasn't dull. So you've got treble that, with digital transfers of old records, like old Michael Jackson or Boston or old rock and roll records, like, man, why are they so bright and thin and there's no bass? Because they transferred it off of tapes, which were supposed to be cut to vinyl and have, not a lot of bass. And if you listen to the vinyl record, the original vinyl, you're like, oh, there's a ton of bass, and it's like the frequency response is really pleasant. And you listen to the digital and you're like, God, this is like a terrible transfer. It's so thin. And you've heard that like old records, and you're like, I remember the vinyl sounding cool, and then the digital is awful. So digital is the opposite of analog in that sense, in that we're taught to, as engineers, to cut only at every step along the way. And the reason for that is, I might be roasted by people who understand this stuff even better than I do, but my understanding of it is, whenever you do any sort of gain change in the digital realm, there's a word length, bit word length, right? Which has been talked about a little bit in the headphone circles. And essentially what bit word length is the chunk of code that determines, essentially the gain setting for, because digital circuits essentially work similar to the way analog circuits do. They're just in code rather than in transistors and tubes and things like that. So bit word length has to be recalculated every time you make a gain change, right? And you lose a little bit of data to truncation every time you do that. What happens when you boost is, in digital, is not only do you add noise, which digital has pretty low noise, but you'll always add a little bit of noise, is that you run the risk of having more information lost than when you cut. And it has to do with how we do volume compensation, right? If you turn up the gain for the entire mix and then only cut via EQ, you're actually going to get a cleaner sounding digital mix than if you boosted everything and then cut the whole mix back. And it has to do with how bit word length is recalculated, because it's better to adjust gain for the entire mix down or up, than it is to boost every little thing. Because every time you boost,
I got you.
You've got, say, 50 tiny little boosts, which are destroying the bit word length a little bit more than 50 cuts, which are less damaging to bit word length, and then boosting the whole thing, which does only one. Boosts are worse for bit word length than cutting, essentially.
Right. Okay.
That's a vast oversimplification of why that works. But translated to the consumer process, right? So with the Penrose EQ or Resolve, or there's a million EQ, SonarWorks, anything you're using out there, is generally best to cut for two reasons. One is that you are losing the least fidelity, right? But the other reason is that you have, in consumer level stuff, often a fairly aggressive auto gain function. And you don't want that auto gain function to be turning you down, because as we know, right, transients and the punchiness, right, and the relative sense of dynamics in a headphone are determined a lot of times by transient and decay plot, like what you see in a decay plot, right? The transients. What happens when you filter anything with an EQ or a gain plugin of any kind is you are losing transient definition, whether it's minimum phase and you're losing phase information, or it's linear phase and you're getting transient ringing, right? So minimize that. If you cut, you are getting, you're essentially retaining the dynamics of the headphone by only cutting, right? Or any speaker, right? So that you don't have auto gain, then also applying another layer of DSP on top of that. So you're trying to minimize the amount of DSP so that auto gain isn't going nuts. And you're also trying to preserve transient fidelity as much as possible. And that's why generally you want to cut all the time with any sort of EQ. That's my personal, again, vast oversimplification of that, but that's my personal take on it.
Now, is this something that's, I'm just wondering if this is like more in the theory space, or is this like more in the tangible, like, you know, you can hear the difference side of things?
I can hear the difference.
Okay, cool, cool. So it's not just, you know, strictly theory and
yeah. The other thing too is if you have, say your headphone has got not enough energy at 2K, you want more 2K.
Yeah.
If you cut 4K and you cut 1K, what you end up with is something that sounds like you have more 2K, but less processed and with greater punch, because you're not pushing the driver further into a realm where it's not comfortable going, right? Drivers only have a maximum excursion they want to be pushed to. Some drivers take EQ very well. Planar magnetic drivers take EQ really well, right? Anyone who's ever tried to EQ the bass up on a Sennheiser HD800 to a point where it's really, really satisfying and fat knows that it's just, there's limits to what that driver will do in that enclosure, right?
Right.
And it's an amazing driver, and I have this crazy set of modded HD800s, and I love them. But there's a limit to what the excursion of that driver can do, right? Yeah. So to me, it sounds like, and again, because you don't have the auto gain function, you have to then pull down the volume. It's less processed sounding than a boost. It's less grainy. Like boosts, oftentimes in the digital realm, will sound gritty and grainy. And even distorted sometimes if you push them too much. So also not pushing the driver past where it's comfortable, right? Because cutting stuff just means, oh, the driver now has to do less of that at those two frequencies. Much easier for it to do than to boost. And so you're going to get better transient fidelity because the driver is behaving in its passband in a way that the designer intended to, right? If the driver was supposed to have this much energy at 2K and it was damped that way, but you want more 2K, pulling back 4 and 1 is going to give you more 2K energy without pushing the driver first. It's going to make the driver it's work less hard, right? It's going to make it easier for the driver to do what it does.
Right. So I never like had the reasons behind why I advocated for the more conservative EQ, but I imagine that this would be one of them. That we could take, you know, an oratory EQ preset, you know, or something like that, where he's sort of done, or, you know, what Jaco Passanen's done with the auto EQ and stuff like that, and perfectly match whatever target we want. But there are potentially reasons why we would want to be, you know, like 3 filters or something like that instead, or, you know, be a little bit more, you know, fewer filters in general. And then also, I mean, what you're saying, as well, is that, you know, fewer filters, but also cutting rather than boosting.
Yeah. And the fewer filters thing too, people think about EQ nowadays, especially people who are my age or of my demographic, who are like young people who came into production and have only worked digitally. I've worked on analog boards, and I have some friends who are vinyl master cutting engineers. Actually some of the best vinyl mastering cutting engineers in the world, and they've explained this stuff to me. So I've been lucky enough to like learn about this, and I'm also like a massive nerd, and I have a physics minor, and so I'm like kind of into this. But I wouldn't know this if I was just a musician or even a mix engineer who was, you know, of my age or even in my 30s, right? But people think about that graphic EQ where you see multiple bands and you can pull it up and down, and it's, you know, the modern EQ, right? Like FabFilter Pro Q or DMD Equilibrium or Auto EQ or whatever. That broken down into its component layers is a bunch of filters, right? So they're filtering everything out from that one band on either side. So you only get, you know, 1 to 2K, and that has to be done either IR, FIR, which have different ups and downs, minimum phase or linear phase, you know, with all the associated aliasing, ripple, distortion, all those, you know, bit word length recalculation, all that stuff that happens that cause filters to distort. However small, they do cause filters to distort. And you have now 10 of those, right? Well, if you could have accomplished what you did with only 2 or 3 of those filters, why would you add the 10 other filters in? Because they're filtering the audio and then putting it back in, but your audio is being filtered, right? And so this is why people in the pro world make a big deal of like, hey, when this band isn't being used, it's out of the signal, because that is a big deal, and it's not necessarily non-trivial to do that. So using as few filters as possible, using only the bands you need, is better because you are literally doing less filtering to the audio.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned something just now about CSD, decay plots and stuff like that. And I think in some, core circles, there's a bit of debate as to what this stuff means. In large part, I mean, going back and reading the stuff from Floyd Toole about how headphones are minimum phase devices and stuff like that. What's sort of your take on that?
So I think two things, and what he means when he says headphones are minimum phase devices. I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people are trying to address with, like HRTFs and time delay and things like that.
Just so everyone's aware, minimum phase device means that the time domain information would be proportional to frequency response.
Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So I think, in a sense, the headphone, right, has one major advantage, which is that the acoustic space that it acts in is very controlled, right? It's very relatively to speakers. It's much easier to measure. You don't have to have a giant anechoic chamber. You don't have to have, a really damped room and a super high quality, super flat microphone even. You can measure a headphone, and it's relatively more simple than measuring a speaker in terms of cost and accessibility and things like that, right? Not saying it's simple or trivial from a scientific perspective, but it's simpler and less expensive than measuring a speaker. And so, but speakers have just been around for longer, right? So when you are looking at waterfall plots, for example, to me, waterfall plots are one of my favorite things to look at in terms of measurements, because to me, they tell me the most about a headphone from a single plot, right? If I only had 2 plots I could ever look at for any headphone for the rest of my life, my like desert island plots, it would be waterfalls and it would be transient, like impulse response.
Sure, yeah.
Or possibly square wave, one of the two. Which is interesting that Tile used to measure those, and not many people measure those anymore.
See, I asked people about that, like even because I wanted to do that, and then everybody kept asking me, why would you want to measure square wave?
Oh, square wave tells you so many interesting things.
See, that's what I always assumed from reading Tile stuff too, right?
Yeah. So square waves, I mean the slew rate, right? Because a square wave is the sum of all possible musical informations within a given period, right? And a square wave, the way that a square wave meets should be theoretically perfectly 90 degrees with a perfect square wave. It never is, right? And you'll see how the tip and how that bends or distorts or does whatever it does. That tells you a lot of things about slew, about transient. It actually, in some ways, tells you more about the transients than the impulse response does. It tells you a lot of things. But how that square wave bends and how the top is straight or not straight, or what non-linearities are there, tell you a lot about the impulse and transient response of the headphone. But CSDs to me are really useful because they give me an overview of the frequency response, which is not merely here's what the level is at a given frequency, because there's a lot of problems with that, right? The relative sensitivity of the headphone, the relative sensitivity and impedance of the amplifier or output device that you're using, right? Those are all huge interactions, right? If you're using a high output impedance tube amplifier, we know this in headphones, you'll totally change the frequency response of the headphone. However, a CSD may show you that same frequency response based on impedance, but it will also show you ringing and decay, right? So a good example of this is the ortho wall, as people have termed it, right? That 4 kilohertz or 4,500 hertz ringing that a lot of orthodynamic headphones have, because it's the resonant frequency of the diaphragm, I think is the going understanding of it. We actually still don't have a great understanding of exactly what it is, but it's like a resonance in the diaphragms. And that 4K thing doesn't show up at all in any headphone that's orthodynamic in the frequency response plots. It only shows up in the CSD.
Right.
But I know people who can hear that, not as an actual ringing like it's audible, but they put them on and they're like, oh, this like give me headaches, or like, why do these sound so weird, or like fatigue.
So there's a correlation there with some other part of the experience.
Yeah, because our ears are very sensitive. And one thing about measurements is we don't have good measurements yet. We don't even know how the measurements that we have correlate to what our ears hear in a particularly sophisticated way. You would need someone, not even Harman has the resources to do that. You would need someone like Apple or Amazon to spend billions and billions of dollars studying the ear and studying how the ear and the brain and putting, neurological, pins and things and MRI machines all over someone's brain while they're listening to headphones to even begin to understand how the ear interprets what it's hearing and how to create a good set of audio suite measurements. So we have a very, very crude understanding of measurements, and we're not even sure that our measurements are the right thing. They're just what analyzers happen to be able to measure, right?
So that's always been my criticism of ASR.
Yeah. You know, and the thing is, if you're happy with a topping D30 and a, you know, whatever, like, fine, great.
Yeah.
You know, we always say like, hello, welcome to Headfi. Sorry about your wallet, right? So if that makes you happy and you're a very cerebral person like that, that's totally fine. I have no problem with that. But for me, I also have to listen to stuff. And the pro audio world, which I am deeply immersed in, is kind of interesting because there are just as many, you know, audiophiles and nerds as there are in hi-fi. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't sound good or it sounds like sterile and cold and you need to make a record that sounds warm and vibey, you're going to buy the gear that makes it sound warm and vibey. You don't care how it measures.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the sonic result that is, and we've all had those moments in pro audio where it's like, we know exactly what our EQ sounds like. We crank it up at 800 hertz. Like, yeah, it sounds awesome. You look down and it's all in bypass and you're like, God damn it. Like, we've all been there. We've all failed double blind tests. Like, we've all been there, you know, even the top guys, like some of the most incredible engineers and mastering guys that I know are like, oh yeah, I was like totally sure that I was boosting at like 4K and it was sounding awesome. And I looked down and my EQ was just off. Wasn't getting the signal.
Yeah, you convince yourself that it's better because you did something.
Yeah. But to me, the CSD plots are really, really interesting because they reveal those resonances. Like sometimes you hear a headphone, you're like, the frequency response is good, but there's like something annoying about it, or it's real fatiguing after a while, or like it sounds like the imaging isn't very accurate, or the soundstage isn't good, or it's like really small, or it's really huge sounding, or like there's a sense of spaciousness to it that I don't get with another headphone that has a similar frequency response. Why is that, right? A lot of those things are things, I'm not going to say you can tell based on the CSDs, but they're things that can give you hints as to why that might be in the CSDs, right? Decay and ringing. A great example of this is if you have any recordings that have like really clearly recorded triangles or bells or like high frequency things like that. There's an 8th Blackbird recording called Hand Eye, and there's I think it's called Pulse or something like that. It's the 3rd or 4th track, and there is a bell that was recorded with an AEA ribbon mic that is so crystal clear it decays for like 30 seconds, and it's just that there's like almost nothing going on around it.
Yeah,
that is one of the easiest ways to tell if a headphone is distorting or not decaying properly, or there's funky stuff going on. And there's a lot of headphones, even some very good ones, you know, that you'll hear and it's like the bell tail will go like, or there's like funny little noises or like distortions or crackly stuff, really, really way low when you crank it up loud. And it's like, that, you know, that funny little wrinkle that you see in the CSD, that could be related to that. And so for me, it's, again, we're shooting in the dark with measurements, but for, you know, the blind leading the blind, to me, the CSD is actually very useful because it tells us all those things that we tend to assume are qualitative. Like, why does the headphone feel fatiguing even though it doesn't have too much treble? My ears still hurt after I listen to it, right? Or like, why does it seem like the presentation of instruments or reverb is not like good in a way that, you know, it doesn't decay in a long, smooth way, or, you know, just things like that. So it's like small things that, or like there's a lot of 500 hertz on this headphone, but there's no like punch to anything there.
Yeah, that's actually another really common one. Like you know, Hi-Fi Man Aria measures really well in the bass, like really well extended, almost like a little bit of a boost there too. But when you listen to it, it doesn't sound like it has the punch, right? And actually, I was even measuring it with in-ear microphones to see if it was like a unique coupling effect, and it wasn't. Like even with in-ear mics on my own head, it still had the same bass response. So it was interesting. Actually, just stepping back to the CSD topic, it's interesting to hear your perspective on this because, you know, there are so many people who read the stuff from Floyd Tool and go, wait, so if we fix something in the frequency response domain, then it should also fix it in the time domain because headphones are supposed to be minimum phase devices and generally be proportional. But I always thought that was, I mean, he wrote that a long time ago, and I always thought that, you know, maybe there's more to it than that now when we have different headphone types with different transducer types like planar magnetics, where they do have something like the ortho wall and whatnot, right? Where back then all he's looking at really is like a HD6 whatever, and it was not, you know, he was there weren't as many variables to, you know, to look at, and so I wonder if now, if the same investigation was done, if the conclusion would be the same, because again, I was just talking to a bunch of people about this, and it seems like, you know, the consensus is that we just don't know. Like it looks compelling, and we want it to be compelling, but there's information pointing both ways on this.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't know if you've read Chonkamel's big thing on I think he's got it posted on his LinkedIn. But it basically goes into the subject where it tries to investigate the merits of evaluating CSD for the way that we are, and then also, I mean, just things that it might show up in the time domain information, but there's still question marks about at what threshold those things are audible. And so I'm inclined to agree with that, your assessment there, that it's the measurements that we have right now, we are shooting in the dark in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And so I actually, before I ever worked for any hi-fi companies, I actually used to work doing some psychoacoustics research for people who made, this is actually kind of interesting, microphones for sonar. And essentially what we were doing was working on space mapping using sonar, and the microphones were specifically used. One of the industrial applications was basically making sure that cargo ships don't crash into whales, right? Which is kind of sounds funny, but it's a big problem, right?
I imagine, yeah.
And so we were doing a lot of interesting analysis of like how how sound is moves through space and how it's portrayed by the ear, because the ear of a whale is surprisingly relatively similar in terms of the basic functioning of the human ear. And one of the interesting things is timing and timing are not always the same thing, right? Sometimes when we talk about time delay or group delay in like the digital realm, it's not the same thing as acoustic timing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are actually, they're the same word, but they're different things, and so they're not always equal. And I think part of the other thing too is like a sine sweep in FR or in the CSD is a sine sweep. It's not a complex musical signal. Musical signals are incredibly sophisticated and it's difficult to understand how a transducer interacts with them, because it's very different than how they interact with test tones.
Mm-hmm.
So even the test tone isn't a gospel, right? It gives us some information, but we're still it's still guesswork. And also, a CSD and the FR, they go hand in hand. So this is something I think about with relation to what you just said, is like, it's all interconnected. Mm-hmm. So you can have a headphone that seems to have a really, really good FR, but then it sounds overdamped, and you look at the CSDs and it's all like ultra hyper short, and you're like, wow, there's like no energy at 500 or 1K.
Sure,
and it sounds dry, right?
Yeah.
And for me, this was actually something interesting I realized in talking to some people in the headphone realm, is there's two basic perspectives on this. One is you can damp out the resonance, and then the other is you can try and design a driver and an enclosure which have a relatively accurate frequency response with minimal damping. Mm-hmm. And the reason you might want to damp out the resonance is to get a good frequency response, right?
Yep.
And this is the approach that someone like Dan Clark Audio takes, right? Yep. Where he has very heavily damped drivers, and the frequency responses are great. Sometimes the more qualitative perceptual elements are like, it can be a little dry, right? With some amplifiers or things like that. And I love his headphones, so I have nothing against that approach. And then you can also listen to some headphones and it's like, wow, they have massive dynamics, but the frequency response is not that great. You look inside, there's not a lot of damping there, right? So there's ups and downs to both of them, right? Do you want to kill your dynamics, or do you want to, maybe not kill your dynamics, but do you want to sacrifice some dynamics for FR, or do you want to, have better dynamics, but you're going to have a harder time getting frequency response correct?
It seems more difficult with planars as well.
It is more difficult with planars because they are, I don't want to say less well understood, but there's been less research done on them than on cone drivers. And they also have a much more complex dispersion pattern, because despite being a planar wavefront, you still have nonlinearities in the driver. And when a cone driver flexes and has a breakup mode where the different parts of the driver are moving in opposite, directions and create phase cancellation, a planar driver, because it's a mylar film, flexes slightly, right? And now all of a sudden those out of phase portions are way more complicated and difficult to deal with, and it's more complicated, and they also just behave differently, right? And have different, if you ever heard magnepans, they don't have much dynamics at all because they're not pressurizing the space that much. So, ups and downs, every company has a different approach to solving these problems. In my experience, talking to all the, hi-fi companies, these are things that people think about a lot, like Dan and Sankar and like all these people, like they think about them a lot intensely, and you may not agree with their specific approach, but like, this is something that like people think of, that people do really, try to address.
It's not like they're unaware.
No, they're not unaware. They're very aware of like how their stuff sounds, So I think, to speak to your point though, like timing in the sense that, like, yes, a headphone is a minimum phase device, is like, yes, but also it's more complex than that. And I think that for me, right, one of the interesting parts of the headphone hobby now is that, like, the new high resolution frontier is gaming, and games have a lot of spatial audio built into them already. And so what you're trying to do then with gaming is not actually design all this DSP and all this stuff, but actually have a less processed headphone that acoustically couples and has spatial accuracy, right? And maybe, you know, something that takes into account how different, you know, because with a headphone you have one driver generally, right? But that one driver is going to have different portions of the driver that are more or less accurate at different frequencies, right? Like the area of a cone driver, right? Different parts of it are going to be more bass or treble heavy depending on which parts of they are, and they're right next to your ear, right? And your ear is a very complex system. So, like, you know, why has somebody not come up with something that kind of directs those different frequencies, different parts of the ear, for example, right? This is very complicated stuff, and I think is to me is kind of something that I'm interested in seeing, because at this point I feel that we have somewhat, the industry started to get somewhat of a handle on, like, what a good average frequency response curve is. Not everyone's going to hit exactly, but they're kind of around it at this point, right? Many of them, and
at
now,
least above 1K. I think there's
at least above 1K. Right? And now we're looking at something which is much more complex, which is, how does our ear actually take that information and create localization cues or sound cues or like, you know, things like that. And this is assuming that you have, like, good FR. And I think for what I've noticed is, and this is kind of bringing it back to the O'Toole paper, is that if you have good frequency response, you're going to tend, the things that make good frequency response are going to tend to put other things in a headphone's performance in line, right? And I think that was, so we were talking before the live stream started about how Sean Olive has the Harman curve, which he derived from listeners, right? But there's another curve which looks very similar to the Harman curve, not exactly, but similar, which is derived from the average of recordings over the last 40 years, say.
Do you remember what the name of that that other curve is?
I don't know if it's public, actually. This was in discussion.
Because I know that there was also the Fleischmann research, which was
there was also Fleischmann research.
Yeah, similar to Harman.
What's the other curve's name? The T-list curve, I think. Is what it was called.
Yes, yeah, there is a T-list.
No, he's kidding. He's kidding.
T-list from that's the Indian YouTube channel. But there is a.
Oh no, he's talking about Taran.
Yeah. There is, though, the Fletcher-Munson curves, right?
Yes.
Which is something that almost nobody talks about either, is equal loudness curves. And I think, you know, if you look between all these, there are some big similarities between them. And the things, again, that you're going to get at, you know, say 85 dB or 80 dB average listening levels between average recordings from an average listener preference are going to tend to narrow you in on a target curve, which is, if you design a headphone well and take care of your distortion and acoustic design and all that kind of stuff you have to take care of, is going to tend to get towards that kind of curve. I've also heard the theory that people say, like, if you have a very flat frequency response at the outer ear, that's going to translate into something that looks like the Harman curve on the inner ear. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not. I've heard that theory espoused. But I think essentially, you know, the things that you have to do to design a good headphone frequency response wise are going to tend to get you in the direction of, you know, because if you have enough at 3K, right? The big thing about Harman that was shocking to all of us when it came out was, like, there's a freaking huge bump at 3K. Like, why is there such a huge bump? But then you listen to it and it works on headphone, like it works, you know, and it makes things present in a way that, you know, having that range more recessed doesn't.
Actually, on that subject, I mean, there's a lot of people who see that and they've heard something that gets close to, you know, that kind of energy in the ear gain. And they think to themselves, wait, this doesn't sound great at all because it's you know, shouty or whatever else, not realizing that the issue with that is that the rest of the frequency response is not in balance with where that 3K energy is, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about the level of the 3K, it's about everything else, you know, sort of above
in
it.
relation.
In
relation to itself. And you know, and in relation to, again, the equal loudness curve, because if you crank stuff up and listen to metal at like 104 dB, like, you're going to have a very different taste in gear than someone who listens to classical music at like 78 dB.
Yeah.
Right. And this is one thing that I always try to, you know, when I was reviewing, I did talk about this a little bit. Like, I am very constant in my listening levels. I have a very constant listening level. I tend to check with microphones and decibel meters, like where are my listening levels, and to try and match them at different frequencies across different headphones so that I can try and be as consistent as I can. The brain is always going to fool itself, but yeah, exactly right. An SPL meter is like the most useful thing you can have when you're listening to try and just check yourself, right?
Yeah. Well, and also like I've realized that like when I mainly use that for being able to plot accurate distortion measurements, because my understanding is that like if you're not SPL calibrated, then they're sort of meaningless, right? Because it could be anywhere. But the other thing I've noticed is like I'd calibrate that for, you know, well, say I play a test tone that I know is at around like 84 dB. When I listen to music, that's not at 84 dB. That's way lower. But it can depend on the music, right? It can depend on the recording. So
yeah. And again, music, dynamic signals, complex, even very simple music is very hard for us to analyze, and it's very hard for it to be understood by even sophisticated AI and analyzer, you know, readouts. So there's still a lot we haven't solved in that department.
Definitely. I guess we should talk a little bit about Audeze, hey? I know we've been going for
sure.
We should talk about Audeze, or we could dive into the chat. I wanted to actually also just say, Tyler, how's it going, man? he's moderating the chat for anybody who's unaware.
The chat is super active. I've been glancing over at it.
Yeah,
you guys have an awesome chat.
Yeah, should we dive into the chat or how you feeling?
Having fun.
Yeah, they're goofing off. It looks like it's a good time.
Yeah. I know you had sort of a cutoff time at around noon.
I actually can go until I have something at 1 o'clock.
Okay.
But I'm free anytime before then, so we can keep going.
Okay.
So
yeah. So with the Audeze stuff, I guess, I mean, how much are you sort of involved in like the given your experience reviewing headphones? Do they ever come to you and say like, hey, what do you think of this, or what do you think of this prototype, or what do you think of this tuning? Like, is there any of that kind of back and forth?
So I'm still relatively new with the company, so I'm still kind of sorting that. And then obviously with, COVID being a thing, right? Trips to HQ are as infrequent as possible. We're trying to be safe about that. But yeah, they do, Sankar will come to me. He's like, all right, put your reviewer hat on. Yeah. What do you think of this product? And I'll be like, okay, well, maybe the build is plasticky. It needs to be better. Or maybe, the sound is a little funky here. Or I could use a little more here, or a little less there. Or, the packaging is kind of hard to take apart. You should make it easier to open up, or, just small things. So there is feedback there. I would say there's a couple of like hardcore audiophiles on the team. Everyone is, almost everyone on the team is a gamer or into pro music or something of that kind, in a band, something like that.
Yeah.
But of the I would say really dedicated hardcore audiophiles, so have stereo systems, listen to headphones a lot, all that kind of stuff. I'm kind of part of a core group of audiophiles on the team. And we do get, we do give our feedback on the sound, and we work with Dr. C, our, chief technical officer, and give him feedback and give the dev team feedback and things like that about frequency response, about our listening experience, about, does this product, is it comfortable on the head, stuff like that. So it's a group effort, but I would say there's definitely, they do come to me, especially when they're asking about like, hey, we've got a product that's in X category. Like, who are some reviewers that would be good? And, I'll be like, okay, well, Critical and, the headphones.com guys and, whoever, like, send them to these guys. I think they would be interested in this category of product or whatever.
Right.
And, and also like, hey, I know, like Steve Guttenberg's probably not going to like this product because he doesn't really do these, this kind of product, or like
send him a
Penrose
kind
of, yeah, right. Like, it's like, are we going to send Steve a Penrose? I mean, Steve's, we could if he wants one. I doubt he does, but
he's secretly really into Call of Duty, so he's
secretly
just kidding.
He's secretly, it's the secret identity. It's Iron. Yeah. He's the best Warzone player in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
But he has some. He's crazy. He's hilarious, actually. I don't think people realize how funny he is. But no. So there's certain things like that. They'll ask for feedback, especially related to what kinds of products, which reviewers like, or what I think if I were a reviewer and I was to give feedback on this product. So yeah, that is a part of our process so far.
Stuff that makes sense for the given,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So,
and I mean, you guys are now, both feet in on the gaming stuff, as you're saying.
We are, yes. There's a lot going on in that space, and it's, that could be someone who you could have 2 or 3 of me just in terms of the social and the Twitch and the video making, all that kind of, and coordinating with streamers and all that kind of stuff. You could have like 3 of my position and they could just do gaming, and we would probably still need more people to do it because it's such a huge market compared to, I mean, even music industry, our music industry side is like way bigger even than the hi-fi side, and the gaming side absolutely dwarfs even the, you know, even the bedroom producer market is dwarfed by the gaming side of things. So it's interesting for us as still a small company, because we are still, you know, small. I don't think 20 full-time employees max, probably less, like 17 or 16.
But with the I guess the dive into the gaming side of things, I mean, you guys have the Mobius, the Penrose, and now the HyperX. Well, before the Penrose, but the HyperX.
The Cloud Orbit.
And
then also the GX.
And the GX. Yeah. So there seems to be there's several different approaches to, you know, in those. Obviously, the Penrose is the newest one, and that's, you know, the low latency. I guess is it correct to say that it's kind of like a low latency Mobius?
Essentially, yeah. So the Mobius, we get a lot of questions about this too, the difference between Mobius and Penrose. And essentially, right, the Mobius is designed to do surround sound and the DSP in the headset, right?
Yeah. Head tracking, and all the rest of that.
The head tracking, all that stuff. And head gestures, which I think they added recently, which has been actually kind of an interesting conversation with the disabled gaming community.
Interesting.
Because you can use the head, you can independently assign those head gestures. And so we've actually gotten a small market of folks who use it to enhance their ability to play games.
That is really interesting.
You know, customized controllers.
Yeah,
so
that's
a
really
pretty cool angle. I would like to do a piece about that because I think it's a really interesting story.
Yeah.
I don't know the whole story behind it, but I've been told a little bit, and it's kind of actually quite cool and somewhat heartwarming, I think. But the so the Penrose is, you know, obviously very similar form factor, the same form factor as the Mobius, and you know, similar drivers and things like that. It just doesn't have all of the DSP in it, and so that enables the latency issue to be addressed. So there's a lot lower latency, which is a big thing for especially, you know, console gamers who, I don't know if you've ever tried to use a Mobius on console, but you have to use it wired to get the latency low, and it still has a certain.
I still need to get a console. That's where I'm at.
I don't have any of the new ones. I have like an old PlayStation 3, and I think I have a PS4, but I don't use it that much. But yeah, it's, you know, but with Mobius, you know, you will always have a certain degree of latency because DSP just takes a number of samples of latency, right?
Yeah.
There's no way around that.
Yeah.
Wired, it's quick enough for most gaming, but if you're an FPS gamer who demands sub 20 millisecond latency, and 20 milliseconds is roughly, in most people's opinion, where picture and sound start to desync. More latency than that is you're gonna notice a slight desync of the audio, and lower than that, generally your brain shouldn't notice too much desync of audio for film, picture, and most gaming. So it's something there was a lot of work done to get the latency real low on Penrose, low enough for FPS gaming.
And wireless, wireless,
right? Which is, again, non-trivial. It's a lot more difficult than it seems.
I think I remember watching you play some Overwatch, and it was pretty good. I mean, I was actually really impressed at how well you were able to just sort of like talk about various different subjects while still winning.
Yeah, that's hard. That's a hard one. I've been a gamer. I mean. For a long time. I picked up my first video game controller. I was like 9 months or 10 months old, and I was like fiddling around with my dad's Sega, and which always annoyed him to no end. But yeah, it's really hard to talk and game at the same time.
I used to be a streamer for some competitive stuff, and there's always people asking stuff in the chat, and you're like, how am I supposed to do both these at the same time?
Trying to watch the chat, trying to respond to the chat, and not die is really hard.
Exactly.
So I had to practice that a lot. I got in some practice because I used to do more streaming and video production and some, you know, voice acting and stuff like that. So so I have a little bit of experience with that, but it's difficult, and the audio does help, surprisingly, actually. You know, sometimes I'll notice something in the game, and you know, your ears are, of the sensory organs that we have, some of the most sensitive. You know, eyes are relatively easy to fool. They're not that accurate. Your sense of taste is pretty accurate, but it's limited. You only have 6 or 7 basic tastes, and then you have about 400,000 different smells that we know of, right? And touch is not that accurate at all, right? Like it's pretty blunt force instrument. But ears, our sense of hearing, is one of our most accurate, and also one of the most ingrained into our brain, right? The centers in our brain that process auditory information are very deeply wired and connected to our sensory modality centers for sound. And that's actually really unusual. There's an enormous amount of processing, first of all, compression and EQ and all that filtering that our ears do to the sound.
Yeah.
But it's also, it's got a shorter, yeah, it has to be there, but it's got a shorter path to our neurological centers than our eyeballs or our fingers do.
That's interesting.
Which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And
That's
our
really
sense
cool.
of our ears, actually, there's two interesting things. First is called autoacoustic emissions, which is our ears actually make sound as well. They make little tiny sounds in relation to what we hear in the environment, and then EQ and change what we're hearing and getting sent to our brain based on their little test tones that they send out, which is really weird and fascinating. There's a whole
that's like sonar.
Section of,
it's like
a whole. It is, yeah. It's like mini sonar. And there's a whole section of music actually that is based on these that is kind of weird and kooky.
Crazy.
But the other thing is that our ears are also connected to our sense of balance, right? People who have problems with their inner ear sometimes will have vertigo or like nausea a lot of the times, and tinnitus, or like, you know, the weird sonic attack things in Cuba. It can give you migraines and make you throw up and all sorts of, like, your ear is very connected to your brain in a lot of weird ways.
I was talking to somebody else about this recently he said, you know, our ears are actually really good measurement tools, which I like to agree with. I mean, obviously not measurement in the sense of like, you know, visually representing data, but measurement as far as like being able to, you know, get an accurate picture of, you know, what it is that we're hearing. Ears are fascinating in that sense. Just getting back to the gaming subject. So there's the Penrose now, there's the Mobius and all those other ones, but then there's also the GX. And I wanted to ask sort of like, there seems to be two approaches here. One is, let's do a lot, you know, well, at least with the Mobius, it's you know, the head tracking, the 3D functionality and all this. I haven't tried the Penrose yet. But the other side of it is, let's have just like a more regular over-ear headphone in the GX, where it's, you know, that doesn't have the you know, all the digital stuff built into it. And it feels to me like there's, at least for the you know, gaming audience, there seems to be two sides of this, and one follows one approach, one follows the other approach. And, you know, I've always been of the opinion, like way back when I was, you know, first getting into headphones, that like I wanted to get away from all the electronics being in the headphone. And now it's kind of like going in the opposite direction of that, where, you know, a lot of the stuff is, there is more interesting ways of doing this stuff when you do have the 3D stuff and the head tracking stuff and whatever. And as we see it with the Apple AirPods Max as well, right, where they're able to integrate that with the content that they're, you know, that they have. So I wanted to get sort of your take on that distinction and on those two different ways of doing it. And, you know, going forward, do you see, you know, which directions do you see this going? Are we eventually just going to be using the, you know, is everything going to be spatial audio, 3D audio in games as well? Or is there still room for, let's say, leveling up in terms of that sort of like traditional audiophile trajectory that just does a better job of, you know, speakers and an amplifier and that kind of thing? Two channel. Or not two channel, but like, yeah, you get what I mean, like left and right.
There's two channel, right? Speakers.
Yes,
are,
that too,
know,
obviously.
Stereo,
yeah.
Like headphones are two channel.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I will say that I think, and I'm still learning the product line because I'm still relatively new at Audeze. So my perception of it is that there is kind of a segmentation of use case. Which is that, if you want wireless and you want the best console functionality, you're going to get a Penrose, and that's kind of, what that's going to be for. And we've also had a lot of streamers who say that they like the Penrose, and the mix amp functionality and things like that. The Mobius is kind of like, if you want the tech and you want I actually love the Mobius for watching movies. If I don't want to bug, my roommate or things like that, they're great for watching movies with, because I can get a surround sound experience and I don't have to have our surround sound stereo set up. Right. So in situations where you don't have that spatialization, that's a really cool thing to have. The GX to me is perhaps the most forward thinking in a way that may seem strange, because I personally think that the future of audio in, say, games and visual content, VR and things like that, is 2-channel headphones, just basic 2-channel headphones, and the DSP processing will be offloaded onto the computer or the game designers, right?
Yeah.
Who can integrate it in a much deeper way than DSP built into a headphone with a tiny little amp and a bunch of chips and things like that.
Yeah.
So it adds expense and cost. You have to have batteries and all this other stuff, right? And there are places for that. Again, if you don't have a home theater setup and you want to have 7.1 surround sound, the Mobius are fantastic for that. And I've seen partners of ours at Pixelogic who do a lot of Netflix sound mixing, and they use the Mobius for QC checking, actually. So there's a post-industry application for that. I think in gaming, to me, I am always like a less DSP is more kind of person. That's my personal preference. I wouldn't say I'm super purist, but I tend towards a little more purist in my audiophile tendencies. Just because
Tyler does too.
yeah. I tend to not use EQ as much, I tend to like things that sound good as they are. And I tend to like to try and have, as little processing as I can. That said, I have heard sound in games that is just unbelievable, like unbelievably beyond anything but the absolute best audiophile recordings I have. And I don't mean like Diana Krall. I mean like recordings that really get me.
So you're talking like the Battlefield games or something like that, or?
I was playing Assassin's Creed Origins, actually. This was a year or two ago, and I had a pair. I got them for my mom, but I stole them. I had a pair of Sennheiser wireless. It was just the cheap ones. It was like RS 150s or something like that, or 160s or something.
I remember that,
yeah, they were cool headphones. They weren't expensive. They weren't, they sound fine. But I had those on, and I remember playing Assassin's Creed Origins, and I was like, just my jaw hit the floor because the sound in that game is unbelievable. I remember I had put a different costume on, and Bayek had a mask on his face. And as I rounded the corner on a building, I could hear him talking to another NPC, and I could hear his voice changing as he had his voice was like muffled through the mask, and I could hear as he walked around the corner his voice bouncing off the other buildings and like being muffled by the corner because my camera was still on the other side of the building, and like I could hear his voice moving and being still muffled as he was like moving around the environment, how it was bouncing around and changing when he entered the room, like totally seamlessly, like the reverb seamlessly changed into a totally different room. And it was like the attention to detail and sound there was unbelievable. And the spatialization of it too was like, I would hear, somebody riding up on a camel behind you. And I was like, whoa, it was truly, it was like the ear was tricked,
Yeah.
And I spent all day listening to, tiny little things and mixes and sound and working on game audio and stuff like that. And my ears were tricked by a basic pair of Sennheiser wireless and, just plugged right into my PlayStation.
Yeah. The flip side though is that there's also some games out there that have really atrocious audio.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that people would want is like, if there's a way to make it so that like the headphones that you're using make it so that the badness of game audio when it is bad is not as bad,
right?
Which is
that's something that I think. So two things. One, obviously, there's something like Mobius does have a place with that, where it can take a game that sounds really bad, put on the warm preset, turn on all the spatial stuff, and all of a sudden you have a much more pleasant experience.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
It might not be as best as the very best, really great games that are out there, but like it's going to sound a lot more pleasant, right?
Yeah.
And the problem, of course, has always been access, right? So the indie games are, stripped or strapped for, resources with regards to how to do this, right? Now with the Tempest engine on PlayStation and Unity having a lot more, Unity and Wise have a lot more support for binaural audio and Dolby and, other spatialization schemes, sound particles, which is now a plugin. I think you can just use it as a plugin for Wise, is super, super cool and allows for developers who are much more indie to do really high levels of sound design and to do really sophisticated and awesome audio for their games and music for their games. And I think that to me, right, that's almost emblematic of like you have the GX, which is at this very high price point, which is like AAA titles with great sound. Like on a GX with a game that has a really good Dolby for headphones or really good sound particles done or whatever spatialization, it's going to sound, to me, I prefer the sound to even, a Mobius or a Penrose.
But that's just like the same would be true then also though for other high end, like
any high end, you're right, any high end stereo headphone will work for that. And in a sense, right, if you look at the Audeze line, the GX are kind of like, I hate to say this because it sounds a little snooty, but like Audeze headphones are expensive. It's a they've brought down the tech
Yeah.
to a price point
And made it lighter,
which is,
more comfortable.
yeah, and made it lighter and more comfortable. It's much, much lighter and more comfortable. They brought it down to a price point where it can play in the very high end of the gaming space, right? And you know, LCD1 is actually another one I've gamed a little bit on, and it works quite well. And you can use any headphone you want. That's I think, to me, right? And if you look at VR implementations where some of the most complicated, you know, ambisonics audio is happening, that system generally just uses 2 stereo headphones, and they do all the processing in the game engine or in the headset.
Right.
The Oculus.
Yeah.
Not the ear headset, the eye headset.
Yeah.
And so to me, that is where the future of, I think, the highest resolution audio lies. I think there's still a place for doing it in the ear cups and having specific purposes, but to me, as someone who does game audio occasionally, that's what I see the future of is actually simpler, right? Is actually going back to just really high quality, low distortion, good frequency response headphones for gaming that have good, you know, sound localization, and then having really, really awesome sound mixing in games, and putting that in the hands of the content creators, right? So
it's funny because like we did a live stream all about, you know, best headphones for gaming and stuff like that, like a while ago, and I think the conclusion was the best headphones for gaming are just good headphones. You know, like every second, you're past a certain point, like it's not as much about, you know, soundstage or whatever. I mean, it is to a certain degree about, you know, positional accuracy for imaging or whatever else, but like good headphones that sound good for music will also sound good for games. So
absolutely. And also, so another consideration with gaming too, which, you know, of course, a lot of the really hardcore headphone hobbyists are going to be listening for long periods of time, but something that's a consideration for gamers especially, and this comes also from the music industry, is they're going to be wearing the headphones for a relatively much longer period of time. So audiophiles are going to be listening for a couple hours to music, generally at lower to medium levels, sometimes loud, but they'll turn it up loud for like a song or two, and then they'll turn it back down, is what the listening habits tend to be. Music industry professionals tend to listen quite loud for like a chunk of time, and then they'll take a break and do something else, or they'll, you know, so they tend to turn the volume down. You know, they'll listen loud for a longer chunk of time, but then they'll not listen for a period of time. Gamers will tend to listen at medium to loud levels for just a long time, just all day. And so that is, you know, something that you have to take into consideration when you're designing headphones for that crowd, right? With equal loudness curves and frequency response and things like that. And suddenly, you know, if you're listening to a headphone at an average of 90 to 98 dB all day long, hearing gunshots right next to your ear that are really loud. I don't know if you've seen it, but Escape from Tarkov and Warzone, the gunshot sound effects are mixed so freaking loud. They're super loud. And in that case, like, adding a 4K dip is probably going to save some of your hearing, you know? Like,
I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense.
Our ears are really sensitive to 4K. If you don't want to have a big old notch there, like, turn 4K down. You'll be able to listen all day to loud, you know, Warzone gunshots.
But that also then goes back to one of the things you're saying before, though, as well, about like the target curves being taken into consideration for what people prefer, but then also conversely taking into consideration what the recordings are. And in the sense of the gaming stuff, if it's more prevalent that game audio has, especially for like FPS games and stuff like that, has these types of features where there are loud gunshots that would typically fall within a certain, you know, frequency range, to make that more, I guess, palatable and accessible for people who are doing that, for people who are specifically in that, you know, environment, constantly listening. That's a really interesting approach.
I think it's also, again, that kind of Harmon curve, you know, style of tuning, or whatever style of tuning, whether it's equal loudness or Harmon curve, whatever, that kind of basic good neutral-ish tuning is not something that is sacred, that everything has to be exactly that, because you don't want to design a headphone that sounds exactly the same for gaming as for music, right? There's actually, and this is one of the interesting things, I did a live stream last week where I was tuning the Penrose, and I was just showing off how I make Penrose EQ presets for specific games. One of the things I talked about a little bit was, if I'm listening to music, you know, the EQ profile I'm going to come up with for classical music versus EDM are going to be different, but also just the basic tuning of the headphone between music and between gaming are going to be different, because in gaming, you can have even more mid-range than that big 3K bump. And it's like, you can have movies and TV be a little bright and a little harsh actually, and they sound okay because those sounds aren't happening all the time, right? Music is very constant, and even though it's dynamic, it's still more regular. Whereas, if it's like a gunshot sound that happens and it jumps and you're like, wow, it's really loud, but only happens once every 5 or 10 minutes.
And it's meant to be loud.
A little bit more okay, and it's meant to be a little more shocking, right? And having more bass. I like more sub bass when I listen to movies and like games. Because I like to feel that rumble. Like if I'm playing Skyrim and a dragon stomping around, I want it to sound epic, Whereas like if I'm listening to music and I'm like, oh, cool, this is like, Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, and the timpani just sounds like this massive, ever-present rumble. It's like, that might be cool, but it's maybe not appropriate to the program.
Yeah, right? Nobody would want that if they were actually going to go to a live recording of it or something. Yeah,
right. So that's something that I think about. I don't know if that factors into our tuning process, but I suspect it probably does.
Yeah.
The use case is important, and there will be slight variations in a centralized tuning based on those due to preference, but also use case.
Yeah. So. For sure. I figure we should probably get into the chat. Guys.
Yeah, I see the chat's ultra active.
Yeah. If you guys have questions for Grover, Tyler, or myself, leave them in the chat and leave a question mark so we know where to look. I'm sure we've lost or missed a ton of already.
I know. I was trying to answer a few of them that I saw, but it was fast.
Tyler, did you... you're muted, I think, Tyler.
There was a couple questions. Most of them are pretty standard. Somebody asked Resolve what games you played.
What games I played?
Yeah.
So I was for a long time I was a StarCraft 2 Grandmaster. I played that very, very competitively, to the point where I was playing against Koreans and losing, as one inevitably does. And then I also play a lot of like competitive FPS stuff, but that not so much these days, just because I haven't had the time. But I used to be into like COD and Battlefield and stuff like that, CS:GO, Overwatch as well. More recently, I've been having fun with Warzone just because it's easy to just get into and have a bit of fun with with friends and stuff. But yeah, my competitive gaming hasn't really been something, or it's not been something I've been doing the last little bit, just because not enough time to really invest, which is also like I've been of two minds about this, because on the one hand I'm like, I probably shouldn't really spend that much time playing games when I should be working or something else, but the other side of me is like it really does miss that a lot. So I guess I'm in the process of trying to find something that does pull me back in, but haven't found it yet. But I guess Grover, what's your I guess game of choice these days?
What's my gaming life look like?
Yeah.
I've been replaying a lot of like old corny RPGs on my PlayStation 3, but I've been replaying some Elder Scrolls games and modding them and kind of goofing around with that. But someone mentioned Hades. I played
Hades
that,
is awesome.
Quite a bit. Wonderful
awesome
game. I love all the games that I'm blanking on the name of the studio, but they came out with Bastion, and they also came out with Transistor. And they came out with
the spy game.
Yeah.
Supergiant Games is the one.
Supergiant. And they came out with a like a sport. It's like a sports fantasy magic game.
Oh yeah, the basketball
thingy.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard of that until a couple weeks ago, and it looks super interesting. And I'm definitely going to play that. I've been playing some Total War Warhammer.
Oh yeah, I've put so many hours into that.
Which to me, I used to be a GW nerd when I was a kid. I went and hung out at the GW stores. I did the thing with my dad and all that kind of stuff, right? So I know the world well.
Yeah.
And I've been a Total War fan for a long time, since I was a kid.
Yeah, me too.
And to me, it feels like the evolution. It's like, this is what Total War is always meant to be. Is like, it's cool when like Roman legionaries and like Gaelic barbarians are clashing, whatever, but like dragons stomping around and giant ogres and like fireballs flying around. It's like, it feels like the most satisfying use of the engine so far.
I think they're going to do a third one as well. I'm excited for that.
I heard about that.
Yeah.
What else I've been playing? Overwatch, obviously, for a lot of my gaming life has been the Audeze streams lately. So I've been busy with that. But I'm playing some Overwatch. I've been replaying my way slowly through the Halo Master Chief Collection, which is kind of fun because I never owned an Xbox. So I played the original games like at my cousin's house and things like that, but I never actually got to sit down by myself with a controller and like play through them 1 through 3. And then a lot of indie games. I've always been a big fan of things like Flower and Flow and Journey and, games like that. So I've been, I always discover little things on Steam that I enjoy. And then I was replaying some Dragon Age Inquisition and a lot of Baldur's Gate 3, actually.
Oh, that's the new one, right?
The new one, yeah.
That's supposed to be like Divinity
3 or
Original Sin.
4.
It's essentially like it's essentially Divinity 2 on steroids with some cosmetic makeovers and things like that.
I love Divinity. It's great. So I'm hyped for that.
The coolest thing to me about Divinity is that you could, I don't know if they can do this in the new Baldur's Gate, but I think you might be able to, is that they had a mode where you could basically play Dungeons and Dragons in the game engine. There was a game master who could, ask you to roll dice, and you would make your character and you'd run around, and the game master would basically create, encounters and scenarios for you.
Cool.
And I always thought that was super, super cool. I saw I don't really follow Critical Role, but I think Matt Mercer from Critical Role did a demo of it, or like a playthrough of it. And I was like, that's super awesome. I need to get in that. So that's kind of it's been a lot of RPGs and that kind of thing for me. I haven't played as many FPS games. I used to be really good at them. I used to be on the semi-professional Smash circuit, and it used to be like a killer Call of Duty player. And as anyone who's tuned into the Audeze Twitch streams recently, I'm like, God, I'm terrible now.
Well, we have our resident, competitive gamer in Chrono, who he's doing a lot of gaming headset reviews as well and stuff. And he, Tyler and I tried playing with him some Warzone a while ago, and it was I guess we were trying to be a little bit more casual, just chat and have fun. And he's out there just like, carrying
into
us.
The game. It was like he had like 20 plus kills, and it was stupid.
Yeah, we were just like, I'm not really doing anything here.
Yeah, we were chatting. Running around shooting things, and
But any other questions pop up in the meantime? Let's see.
Game talk is boring.
Just game talk.
Okay, here we go. Here's a question. It's a controversial question. What is what is Audeze's take, or maybe what's your take on planar driver crinkles drama that have been going on lately? Not as significant. So I think he's referencing I'm not sure if you've seen some of the Abyss drama that's happened on Reddit, where somebody took apart an AB 1266, and I think that's what he's referencing, right? And the driver looks like the diaphragm looks like it's not well tensioned, but of course there's so much background information behind that as well. Do you have any sort of take on that, or?
I didn't see that teardown, although I heard about it. I don't think I can tell the story, but there's a funny drama story about Abyss from many years ago. But I've heard the Abyss headphones. I always thought they sounded kind of cool. They're so different and like interesting and unusual. The frequency response is kind of interesting. But the dynamics are crazy. Like, I don't think anybody is ever going to argue that the bass on that headphone is
on the full size big one.
1266.
Yeah, the 1266 has like such a cool bass presentation
bass.
that I've never heard anything like it, even on K1000s or the MySpheres or anything. It's just so different and so cool. I don't know about the driver thing. So again, I'm still relatively new at Audeze. I know a little bit about some of our like secret sauce things and how the drivers are made, and there's some very cool things that go on there that I didn't know about planar tech. And Audeze has like a ton of patents on just like some very fundamental, really like good way, like just best practices on how to build planar drivers that are it's like they're quite cool, they're quite innovative, but the crinkly issue, as I understand it, is like you will have, some crinkling when you put the headphones on sometimes.
That's the other kind of
the tensioning thing, right? There's just a
crinkle.
pressure thing, and they just crinkle. Now, in terms of like the crinkle being like an issue or like things like that, I haven't read that teardown. I heard about it, but I haven't read it, so I'm afraid I can't really.
Yeah, I don't think that's in reference to planar crinkle. I think it's more just that when the tension of the diaphragm when they took it apart looked like it was like it had ripples in it. So I think that's what this is in reference to. But I don't know enough.
I know that Dan Clark claims that he has like a intentionally kind of like ribbon styled like
interesting.
Not perforation, but it's like a accordion fold.
Oh yeah, no, that's the
driver.
I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah.
That's a specific thing.
I always thought that was similar to like Audeze's waveguides or something. It was meant to do a similar kind of thing.
Well, there is a flow. That's the flow.
Oh, that's the flow part. Yeah. No.
I've seen there was a diagram he put out a couple years ago where it looks like the diaphragm is. Now I don't know how you exactly do that, because my understanding is like Mylar is, and other materials like that are like you're supposed to like pull them tight.
Yeah.
But I also I don't design planar drivers.
Yeah.
Like I have some understanding of how they work, but I'm not an expert on them, so I can't really speak.
He calls it
V
planar, isn't it?
V planar, yeah. So there is a lot to get around this idea, because you essentially have to have the driver, secured or fastened somehow, and then it flexes in the middle when it goes in.
Yeah.
So everybody solves that differently. Audeze has one way, Dan has another way. I'm sure JPS Labs has some way.
Yeah.
That they do it. I don't know what their method is. I do know that I've seen, a lot of production facilities at this point for different planar drivers, and been given a little bit of a tour of the Audeze HQ, and tensioning is not as much of an issue now as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that tensioning was like a big thing in production consistency, and it was very difficult to get it right. And it wasn't, Yamaha had done it back in the 70s and Fostex had done it back in the 80s. But outside of that, it was a hard thing to get down. But most of the major players, I mean, you'll always have some driver failures and some things like that, but because planar is a little bit tricky to make. But
yeah,
driver tensioning at this point is pretty good from my understanding of it. So
mm-hmm.
I didn't really answer your question. I didn't see the teardown, so I can't really speak to it, unfortunately.
Someone did, or go ahead.
I was just going to say that my take on it right now is that there's a lot of people who are going to see that and go, oh, that doesn't look right. But most of those people probably haven't heard the headphones. So I have a hard time really, I tend to agree with Grover that they do sound quite unique, the Abyss headphones, and super detailed, and the FR is maybe not for me, but I never would imagine that this, all the different indicators that people are pointing to, whether it's the measured stuff with THD and whatever else, or this sort of driver tensioning thing, to me, like when you listen to them, it doesn't sound like what any of those indicators might suggest. That there is some sort of lack of resolution or dynamics or anything else like that, right?
Yeah, I certainly don't hear that.
Yeah.
I certainly don't hear that in the Abyss. It doesn't sound like obviously distorted, or it sounds very high resolution and very, fast and very punchy and very detailed. I think this is also the other interesting part, which I'm of course fascinated by, and I expect you guys probably are too, is cool. There's all this tech stuff, and there's all these like technical things you can solve, and all this cool stuff and graphs and all that kind of stuff. And then you have to make a leap to like, well, how does it sound? Because sometimes it's like, wow, this is super sophisticated, and look all these cool stuff you did, and it measures amazingly, and you listen to it and you're like, this doesn't really do it for me,
I can think of a number of examples.
And same, and then sometimes you're like, God, this thing kind of measures like trash, and it's put together and it's sort of falling apart, and it's like really kludgy. And then you listen to it and you're like, damn, it sounds sexy. It just sounds awesome. Like, sounds badass, And I'm always like really interested in that overlap of like, what makes a difference? What makes things sound good? I mean, there's always some amount of personal preference, but we've all had that experience where we're really excited to listen to something, seems really cool, and it's like, God, this sounds like crap. Like, what the hell? And I know these people are smart. I can look at all the technical documents. The headphone is in order and it's well made, and then you're just like, it doesn't sound good. What the heck? Like, what were they thinking? And even beyond personal preference, I have to imagine that there is a lot of really complicated engineering stuff that you just, sometimes it doesn't always correlate to what we hear, And so it's like trying to figure out which problems are the right ones to solve is hard, right? Because there's a lot of problems to solve. There's a lot of things you could do. There's infinite number of design choices. And that's one thing I've always been interested in. And I'm trying to learn more about both Audeze and other people's processes, because I'm interested in this. It's like, what are the right design choices to make? And what do I hear in one speaker or one headphone that I think is interesting, that I maybe can latch onto and try to apply to another one to see if it also holds, or if I hear some commonality. So something, for example, I use ATC monitors in my studio. You can't see them, but they're right here behind my screen. And they're ultra detailed. They're like some of the most detailed speakers you'll ever hear. And they use paper cones. They're just doped paper cones. There's nothing special. There's not graphite, metal, diamond, ceramic. There's nothing special about them, right? Why are they so ultra hyper detailed, right? And so that's something I've, looked at ATC drivers, and I've picked them apart, and I've tried to figure out why they sound so detailed and things like that, and it's like, okay, well, there's the phase amplitude and the frequency amplitude here, and there's the long coil gap here, and the magnet structure, and what of that is making the difference, what of that is causing them to be ultra detailed and super flat. I don't know. I have some theories, but I don't know. I'm always studying new speakers or new headphones to see, like, is there things that I recognize in the measurements or in the design or in the wiring or anything like that I can like try and understand better and try and figure out why it sounds the way it sounds, because that's still something that I think is ultra mysterious to a lot of us. Certainly myself.
I see a lot of people asking about what your go-to source gear would be, like DAC and amp and stuff like that. But actually, just before getting to that, I want to actually ask about I don't think it's actually controversial, but Sean Olive has commonly and frequently on Twitter pointed out that it's not clear what resolution is, or like what these ideas about detail and whatnot. It basically says, can you identify it? Can you point to it? If you can't, then what are we talking about? Which I understand why he says that, because if it's not something that's easily measurable like frequency response, what is it? And so the question that I would have is, do you think he doesn't hear it? Because or do you think it's not him specifically, but like, do you think there are people who just, they don't hear anything beyond tonal balance and frequency response, or is there more to it than that? Like, everybody hears these differences. So as an example, right, we take something that doesn't necessarily have a great frequency response or tonal balance, but has really good detail and really good technical performance, or whatever we want to call it. Are there going to be people out there who they completely gloss over the latter part of that, the technical stuff, and they're only thrown off, I guess, because of the let's say suboptimal frequency response?
Yes, and a good example of this is Jason Stoddard told me a story one time about how he was at a
Jason Stoddard's from Shit Audio.
Yeah, Jason Stoddard from Shit Audio. Yeah. He told me a story. He was at a someone's house, and they were like, "You gotta hear my system. It's this crazy, like $100,000, $200,000, whatever, crazy big audio stereo rig." And I think it was some huge Martin line arrays or something like that with these big tube amps and all this other stuff. And the guy's sitting there listening, and he's like jamming out, and he's really into it. And Jason's sitting there like, "God, this sounds awful. Like, what the heck?" And the dude is like, "So what do you think?" And he's like, "I'm gonna be real honest. It sounds like 10% THD."
Wow.
And the dude was like, "What?" And he's like, "You need to check your tubes. I think one of your tubes is like burnt out or broken, or your phono stage is got a noisy gain stage, or like something is distorting bad, hard, like really like 10% THD." And the dude was like, "Oh my gosh." And he found out that one of his tubes was old, and he replaced the tube, and he fixed some caps and whatever. And he was like, "How did you hear that?" And Jason was like, "Dude, I sit in a lab all day listening to like transistors and audio parts. Like, I know what 10% THD sounds like." And your ear can be trained to hear a enormous amount of detail about things. So when I was in music school, when I was at Oberlin, we had, as part of our studio recording classes, weekly ear training tests. And it was a bit like it's a custom program version. I think it's called WebTet. You can actually still go and do it. And, you can set up various tests, so like frequency response. So to be like, all right, cool. The first week you're going to have a quiz. We have to go into the studio and practice hearing a 12 dB, cut at, 64 Hertz or 1700 Hertz or whatever, right? We just pick a random frequency, pick a cut or boost, and they would get smaller and smaller until by, the end of the first semester, you had to hear a quarter of a dB boost or cut at any of 15 different frequencies between 60 and 12,000 Hertz. And you had to tell whether it was a booster cut, how much it was by, what frequency it was at. And, you got one chance. Basically, you heard the original, you heard the, the EQ'd or boosted cut version, and you had to just, it wasn't even multiple choice anymore. You had to just type in what frequency, what boost, all that stuff.
Very specific skills for.
They're very specific skills, right? And then we also had to do other stuff. It was like you have to tell how long a decay is, like how many milliseconds, or how much pre-delay, or how much compression is on this. Right. And they all got really granular and tight. And I'm very grateful for that ear training, because it's like I can put on a pair of headphones, or I can sit down in front of a pair of speakers, and I'm like, there's something funky at 18A, or like the bass is like 2.5 dB down at 30 hertz from what I would like to hear, neutral line from the rest of the speaker. Like I can sit down, I can hear that stuff, or I can hear compression, or I can hear the reverb changes or things like that, because I did all that ear training. So the point is not that I have ultra special hearing or I'm special. The point is that you can train your ears very, very specifically, and our habits train our ears for what to listen to, right? So the human ear is an incredibly powerful device, but it is also it depends on how we train it. And so I would say for me, if Sean Olive doesn't hear that, then I believe him. I would say generally people hear, like I believe people when they say that they hear or don't hear what they hear. And if you don't hear stuff, like part of the audiophile hobby is kind of training our ears to hear certain things in music, right? Like, and oftentimes it's when we're kids. For me, it was my dad sitting down and trying to like play the stereo system for me, right? It was like whether I was paying attention to it or not, it planted a seed, and listening to that, like there's little elements that pop out of mixes in hi-fi or like in headphones where we hear the bass a certain way. Like there's all things that we look for, right? And that's kind of what we habitually have trained ourselves, whether we realize it or not, to hear. Those are what we look for as audiophiles. And that's the joy. It's like, oh, cool, I heard the little thing pop out of the mix in a way I've never heard it before. I heard that little cool element in this song that I love, or I heard it with a particularly like just gorgeous tone to it that I really liked the way it was presented. And those are the like aha moments. And I think that to me is, if Sean Olive doesn't get those from listening to music and he just likes to listen to test tones, that's cool. Well, that's his prerogative.
I wouldn't. I want to put words into his mouth as
yeah.
Far
No. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean that came off as aggressive. I didn't mean that to be aggressive. I'm just saying, like, for him, I think, like, he seems to be very like he doesn't want to say
mind is made up.
Yeah, his mind is made up, right? And he said that fidelity is frequency response, and that for him is his version of fidelity. For me, I listen to some things and I'm like, man, the frequency response isn't what I want to hear, but there's a lot of detail going on here. Yeah. And that can be cool in its own way, right? Like, and when I was reviewing for Inner Fidelity, I always tried to take the tack of like, I can't tell you if you should buy this or not, and that's not my job, and I shouldn't be telling you if you should buy this or not. What I'm going to try to convey to you is if I think that this product is well designed for a certain type of customer. So if you like a really warm, luscious sounding tube amp that's got a high output impedance that's going to sound kind of warmer and fuzzier with a lot of headphones, like this is a product that does that really well and is going to suit you if you like the kind of music that works with that well, right? And to try and only send back products or not review products that like I felt had a design flaw. It was like, I don't think you guys intended this to be the way that it was, because some people like warm, or some people like bright, or some people like smiley face shaped EQs, and that's okay. Especially in hi-fi, nobody's job is on the line. It's not like music production or like, anything like that, where it's like your job could be on the line for something sounding bad, right? In hi-fi, it's a hobby. It's so it should
people are free to listen. People are free to like stuff that sounds bad.
Right, you're free to all love exactly the same sounding headphone. No, just kidding. But you're free to listen to what you want to listen to. Right? I've got a whole pair of Beyerdynamics, and they're really bright. And sometimes for classical music, it actually sounds good, right? So I'm not opposed to people liking things that are maybe colored in certain ways, right? I like vinyl. Vinyl lies to you. Vinyl is more colored than digital, right? Digital is more linear, but sometimes it sounds nicer, and sometimes it brings me greater musical enjoyment. So that's fine. I'm okay with that coloration when I'm listening to it for enjoyment. I'm the only person in the room, or me and my friends, or whatever. That's our prerogative to do that. And what does it matter if someone on a forum says, well, your audio system is bad because so it doesn't measure perfectly in the, whatever domain. I'm like, who cares? I had fun listening to my, my records or whatever last night. That's all that's important in that realm,
Audio Quest Night Owl back there. So
yeah. It's like, if you enjoy it, that's fine, and I think the Harman curve and all that research is very important. It helps us understand how to hear and how to tune headphones better and how to get a good, reference point. And that's very important for the industry. But at the end of the day, like, listen to what you want to listen to, And your ear is very trainable. And also, like, bias and listening bias and perception are huge, right? You can get used to a lot of things. Like if you can listen to
Absolutely.
something that has
Yeah.
massive boosts and no bass, and you'll listen to it and you'll be like, yeah, this sounds all right. Like it has enough bass, I'm satisfied. And then
Yeah.
you put on something that has a lot more bass and you're like, why is it so dark and muddy, right? And then you get used to that and you're like, yeah, this sounds all right. And then you put on the other headphone and you're like,
Yeah.
man, this is so bright and awful. Like your ear adjusts
Yeah.
in a pretty amazing way.
Actually, you mentioned something that I think is really interesting, but the idea of training your ear to listen for certain things. What I wonder, this is totally speculative, but like I wonder if people who are training their ears specifically to listen for frequency response related, like fidelity, let's call it, right? That because that's what they're paying attention to.
How much does that bias it?
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm wondering. Is like
I would have the
because
same question as soon
Yeah.
as
because I think you're right. Like they're like you can. I mean, even just as I've been reviewing more and more stuff and been doing this more regularly, the things that I'm noticing as far as detail have changed. So I'm imagining, and also I mean all this stuff, it's like becoming so much more so much easier to identify where various different issues show up in frequency response as well. So I can totally see a situation where somebody's just sitting down and listening specifically for frequency response and then missing all the other aspects of what's going on because they're just so focused on that one thing.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
And it is
thing.
important. Frequency response is big. And in headphones, I would say frequency response is like 70 or 80% of the sound of a headphone.
Yeah.
Like it's a huge element of the sound of the headphone, even bigger than it is in speakers. So it is important. And I don't want to downplay the importance of that. But for me too, once I went through that ear training, and I've talked to other music professionals who are also audiophiles, they're like, the frequency response needs to be sorted. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. There's some room for variation, but it needs to be sorted out. Like it can't be lumpy and peaky and awful, because that's just not going to be a fun listening experience.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that because of our training, because we work with audio every day, we can sit down and we can just be like, yeah, it's like close enough or good, or it's just lumpy and like, you know what I mean? So it's like, that is kind of the like resume, right? And if the resume, the speakers, the transducer is really bad, I'm like, I'm not interested. But if the resume is at least solid, I'll give it a chance and I'll listen and I'm like, cool, like what am I hearing? What are the elements? How's the decay? How's the timing? How's the how's the speed of the driver? How's the punch? Is it dynamic? Does it fill the room or fill the ear cup? Is it what are all those other qualities that are intangibles or less tangibles maybe than frequency response? But I mean the FR has to be there too.
Yeah, totally. I did want to get back to the DAC amp question. So if you could, what are your go-to?
So right now, what I'm running on in my desk, this is like my bedroom, studio, desk space. It's all my things, my PCs here. I have an RME Fireface UFX2, which is kind of my little control center. And then from that, I'm plugging in to a shit Gunyer. And then the outputs from that run to an SPL Phonitor XE. So that's my like typical headphone setup. And then my other setup that I have is a shit Bifrost 2 running into an old Dark Voice OTL, which has been modded a bit. It's got a better power supply, better volume pot. The input tube has been switched out to a 6900 with an adapter. And then I think I have a 6 AS7 swap to an old tongue sole or something like that.
Gotcha.
So that's I'm actually kind of a tube guy. I love tubes.
I mean, I'm just getting into it now with the amps and sound Kenzie right here. It's fantastic.
Oh, that's a lovely amp. I reviewed that
good.
for Interfidelity back in the day. Yeah. And I just had a pair of Justin's amps in my house for a while, the Zions in my stereo system. Incredible, like some of the most amazing amplifiers I've ever heard. But that Kenzie is nice, especially with high Z headphones.
Yeah. That's
it is just gorgeous and rich and lush and like it's nice. He makes really nice stuff, and the build quality is impeccable. So I like him. Really nice guy. Really sweet. Easy to work with. Great gear. But I'm actually a bit of a tube head. The SPL is my reference back from my Interfidelity days and even earlier. So, and I like it because it's solid state. It's just good. It's pretty. It gets out of the way, and it will drive almost everything. I wouldn't say it's like my favorite. Like wow, I enjoy it all the time, but like it's reliable, it's easy, and it sounds similar with every headphone I plug it into. So it's kind of a nice
It's
palate
consistent.
cleansing. It's
Yeah.
lemon sorbet for me, you know.
Nice.
Um,
Getting back
so-
to food analogies.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's kind of my setup. And then I have a bunch of speaker stuff too. I don't know if anyone's interested in that, but that's kind of my headphone setup. So
Yeah.
and then if people are wondering about my headphones, I have piles of Audeze headphones now. Some of them were mine actually. Actually, I had a Mobius and an LCD one before I worked for Audeze. So I've had those for a long time. But then I've got GXs. I have a pair of 4Zs over here, and I'm actually using a pair of 2 close backs to weigh down my microphone.
Oh, wow.
This Sennheiser microphone is too light.
Wait, which close back is that?
It's just the 2 close back.
Oh, LCD 2 close. Okay.
Yeah, LCD 2 close back. Do I have any others? I have a couple Penroses lying around here for testing stuff.
Penroses, Penrye.
And yeah, something. And then I have also a Dan Clark Audio Ether 2. I have a ZMF Auteur.
Oh, I love that headphone. That's one of my favorites.
Lovely headphone.
I hate myself for having sold it way back. I sold it by the Verite, but yeah,
I think I have an open back Verite around here somewhere too. I love Zach too because I used to live in Chicago, and Zach and Bev are good friends of mine, and they're lovely. They make great headphones, and they're super people. So just great people. So just good people to work with.
We were big ZMF fans as well.
Yeah. They're so nice. They're like so nice. They always know the best restaurants in town during CanGen.
Oh, I'd love to go hang out with them
trendy
sometime.
and fun, and they eat well. Let me tell you, if you ever go to a show and Zach and Bev invite you to go eat with them, always take them up on the offer because they'll find like the cool. It's never like super expensive, but it's always like the cool, quirky, like really fun place. Like you'll eat something you never expected to eat, and like they're awesome. So I love them a lot.
Yeah, it's great. Oh, somebody says, sorry, a 1,000 ohm Audeze when?
1,000 ohm Audeze when? I hope so, because I like tubes. But I don't know. I know that I haven't asked about this, but I know that they made some really high impedance headphones back in the day. They had like a 1,000 ohm, 2,500 ohm, and like I think even a 10,000 ohm.
Yeah, that's what Senko was telling me. Yeah.
I think part of it is like those don't really. I don't think the market was really there for those. So they might have just been like our chief technical officer's kind of like, he does stuff sometimes that he's just like playing around, having fun, and kind of like, I think the LCD 24 was kind of like just his personal pet project thing that he did and wanted to put out there. Now I would love to have those amps because OTL amps work really well for headphones. But without a transformer in the way and the tubes coupled directly to transducer, you need a higher impedance driver. And even 200 or 300 ohms is not really high enough. 600 is like a good minimum, and 10,000 is even better.
Right.
So I wish we made them. I think it's kind of expensive to make high Z planar drivers that are, really high resolution, and just not many that people buy them. And then you have to have a nice tube amp to run them with as well. So it's kind of something that I think they determined that there wasn't a ton of market for it. But I'll ask. We'll see.
I think, that question I think is more sort of couched in this idea that, even just talking with Sankar at CanGen last year, where, the headphone manufacturers seem to be trying to make things more efficient, easier to drive. Yet in the audiophile world, all of us have amplifiers anyways. And so we're like, well, no, don't do that. make it more difficult to drive. Let us use our amplifiers. And then, especially because these days there's so many amplifiers coming out that are extremely powerful, that are inexpensive as well. So we see kind of like almost like a bit of like, I don't know, industry dissonance going on because, I guess manufacturers are trying to speak to a wider audience, which makes perfect sense. But I think that's probably where probably where that question comes from.
Yes.
Sorry, Tyler. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just exclaiming at the chat. I forgot I was muted. I was going to say Zach and Bevan are awesome. They always have the best recs for food and everything like that. I agree. That was what I was mouthing, but obviously was muted.
Yeah.
And then someone asks,
is that your puppy in the background?
Yeah, she's running around. Need to care. She's okay. But someone asked, have you heard the Rad Zeros, Grover?
I have not. Oh no, actually, take that back. I have heard them. This was 2 or 3 years ago, I think. CanJam SoCal, I want to say, down in Irvine. I did hear them. They sounded good. They kind of have a little bit
back
of
when they were just being prototype.
They're
When they
just
first came out, right?
started. Yeah, they've
Yeah.
just come out. They have kind of, to my ears, they had sort of a similar house curve to Audeze with a few different,
Yep.
you know, it was a little different. The mid-range was maybe a little bit more dipped, and it was a slightly more V-shaped, slightly more smiley face shaped. I may be misremembering, but I think that's kind of what I recall. But I thought they sounded good.
Yeah.
I don't really know anything about that because Alex was way before my time at Audeze, so I don't know what the drama there.
But yeah. Oh, I don't know about that. I was asked about the drama, and that was more the
But yeah,
sound.
I've heard them. I thought they sounded nice. They're a little
Yeah.
heavy for my tastes, and I'm not usually not fussy about that. I didn't think they were super comfy. But I thought the sound was solid.
Yeah, I think the initial runs were heavier and a little bit
Heavier.
clampier, and then he's
tuned them now too.
the tuning changed, I think, but then also I mean,
Okay.
he can correct me, but like he made them quite a bit more comfortable. I think they're actually under 600 grams now.
Okay.
So they're actually quite a bit more comfy, and he's changed the pads as well to make them less clampy too. For the FR, what I've noticed is that I think you're right. It's actually a similar kind of sound to the Audeze house sound. So with that sort of relaxed, ear gain
Upper presence region.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
the 4K is relaxed.
yeah, a little bit, but I mean it's funny because like there are some Audeze headphones that I've measured that are even more relaxed than that, but then there's other ones like the LCD one that have a little bit more presence there. So it's
Yeah, and I mean, so I don't think I'll get in trouble for saying this. Saying this is Grover, not Audeze
Sure.
employee.
Sure.
But there is some people find that there's not enough 4K energy in Audeze headphones. I don't know why. I don't know if I'm at this point I'm pretty certain that everything that is done in the tuning of the headphones is like a very conscious decision.
do you mean
they're
like for
listened to
the
internally.
big over ear, like the
Yeah,
full-size
like for the
LCDs?
big LCD size. I suspect, again, this is just guesswork, just me as Grover, not as an Audeze employee or representative at all. It's just less fatiguing to listen to for long periods of time.
Yeah,
that's just something I suspect is.
So actually, an interesting thing that I've noticed in my measurements of all the full-size Audeze headphones is that almost all of them seem to have that cut at 4K. But when you try and fill that in with EQ, it does not sound like it works. Like it sounds like, it sounds more like there's something weird going on with the headphones coupling specifically on a measurement rig than it does actually like there's a 4K dip as extreme as what it might look like. And this is why one of the reasons why like I have I'm starting to use more of the in-ear mics to make sure that the coupling, that I get an accurate coupling. But the problem with that, of course, is that like nobody knows what headphones measured at the concha with unique pinna should measure like. There's no standard for that. Plus it misses all the other gain factors that are past the concha. So so it's more just sort of like trying to see whether or not there's any sort of deviation between my pinna and like the Gross's pinna. But that just sort of what I've noticed as far as playing around with getting it to match a target. When it does match the target, it doesn't sound the way that other headphones that match the target do. So I think there is probably something unique going on there with the measurement and the coupling and whatever else.
I don't know how much I can say about this, but I was shown something which was very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that any company making planar magnetic drivers today makes or does the same thing. But that ortho wall thing that shows up in a lot of the CSDs, I would say look at the CSDs on Audeze headphones.
That's an
that
interesting
4K
thought.
region.
That's a really interesting thought. Yeah.
Maybe notice what you see or don't see there.
Yeah. Because that could be. I mean, this is one of the areas where proponents of CSD have often talked about sort of the false null that shows up in a frequency response, where it wouldn't it would show up in time domain information but not frequency response.
Yeah.
So that is actually a very good reason to look at CSDs, I think.
So I think Sankar may have asked me to do a video about this. I need to actually get back in touch with him. I've been a little busy with other stuff, but I think that is something, and I don't want to mess up any information, but that is something that I'm hoping we can do a technical either article or video on, because it's a very cool piece of technology. It's a very interesting solution to an interesting problem. And I can't say more than that at the moment because I need to ask about that and I don't fully understand exactly what it is. But I was shown some stuff that was very cool that I would say look at the CSDs on Audeze headphones and look at that 4 to 4,500 hertz region and look at the CSDs and see how that lines up with the FR and also with the time domain performance in terms of impulse response. and what you see there, because I think you'll find some really interesting things that are like, why do Audeze headphones have this horrible cut at 4K? There's no treble. Because I mean, like, I have some 4Zs here. Nobody I've ever like had here to listen to my 4Zs has ever said like there's not enough treble. They're like, yeah, they're like relaxed at 4K. You can crank them and listen for a long time. You won't get a fatigue, you won't get your ringing in your ears at 4K. And I also noticed that there are some planar magnetic headphones that like if you listen to, and speakers, sometimes you listen to for a long time. I'm like, man, I have like a buzzy ringing, not like tinnitus, but like I have a fatigue in my ears in the upper treble, like upper mid-range, lower treble on a lot of planars. And I'm like, that kind of bugs me. And the Audeze's don't ever do that. I've never had that same feeling. So I have some theories about what's going on with the ortho wall and some things like that. But I mean, I'm not the person who invents it. So
now I need to get some Audeze headphones in again and do that testing. I need to look at this because I definitely didn't look at the CSD for that.
Yeah, look at the CSDs and listen to them like kind of medium loud, like 85 to 88 dB for like a while, and see how your ears feel compared to
damage
other
my hearing
planars.
for a while is what you're saying.
Don't like 90 to 100 dB, but listen to like 85 dB for like an hour or two.
Yeah,
and like see what you notice. Like
85 dB like calibrated.
Yeah, 85
so
dB
music
calibrated.
Isn't actually at 85.
yeah 85 dB calibrated, and like listen to like some metal or like something kind of like 4K, like guitar, like bright 4K guitars, and like see what you notice.
Get some Dream Theater going or something.
So yeah, I only have some inklings of thoughts at the moment about that, but hopefully I can make some content about that and share that with you.
Definitely
guys
let me know what you end up finding, because that's super interesting to me. That type of stuff. Let's do 2 more questions and then I'll let you go. How's that sound? Tyler, was there anything that jumped out?
There's a couple things, but trying to mostly got into like speaker talk, and then I got into some other stuff, like a lot of idiots. I
mean, I love speaker talk too.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I see a question about Audeze weight.
Like, as I said, there's a weight one and some.
So we should just talk about the weight actually in general. One of the things that I've noticed is that with some Audeze headphones, the weight that they end up, like what I weigh on my scale doesn't necessarily match what the spec shows, and I have to imagine it's just because it hasn't been updated or something like that, or there was some change that
probably
makes it,
but somebody the website's not always
I
don't want to say it's not the most up to date, but sometimes it's like things change, or sometimes there's small manufacturing changes that might change the weight slightly. Again, we're a small team, so sometimes it's like it changes and it's someone's like, oh, hey, we got a customer who emailed us, said the website was wrong because they measured something different. And we're like, oh, duh, like we'll go and change it.
So I think the question specifically was whether or not the LCD XC carbon weighs less than the wood-backed one. Because I think on the website right now it shows that they're the other way around. So that's why I think that question. Yeah,
I would send an email to support@audeze.com and ask them that question, because I have no idea.
Well, the question says, how much does the LCD XC carbon weigh? And I think it is published on the website, but I'm just not sure if that's accurate, because it shows that it actually weighs more.
Oh, okay.
So maybe it is.
That might be right. I don't know. Email support@audeze.com. They'll be able to tell you. The guy who runs support is one of the major Audiophiles, really nice guy, Chris Behrens, who's been in some of our YouTube videos recently, who folks may have seen. Really great dude. Email them and ask, because I have no idea. Sorry, I don't have an X or an XC or an old XC.
Someone asks if I'm getting a LCD3 in for review. That seems to be one that's sort of flown under the radar, because I mean I'd like to get in for review, but I have not. It's not on the radar right now.
Well, I will say, we haven't been as focused on our hi-fi product range lately.
Mm-hmm.
Wait.
Is there there's a lot of people who are excited for Audeze in 2021. That's
me too.
Yeah. Not gonna say anything more than that. Okay.
Me too. I'm also excited for 2021.
Yeah. Okay. Last question here. Tyler, anything jump out at you?
I mean, I want to kind of focus it for Grover, but trying to think. I didn't see anything that's like.
Okay, I see a question here, and this relates to one of the things that I've been wanting to ask. Maybe you can give some insight, but The person asks, magnesium carbon with Audeze would be a welcome touch. Not sure if it's doable. So and just speaking with Metal 571 about this as well, the question would be, is it at all possible, say, price no object, if somebody were to reach out to Audeze and say, hey, I want an LCD4, but I want it all magnesium, or I want it to be all like as lightweight as possible without the wood, and not a 4Z or an MX4, but like a full LCD4. Is that something that Audeze entertains, or is this just a pipe dream?
I can't talk about that.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, maybe we
Just
should
wait.
pick a different question.
No, it's a great question,
Yeah.
and I would love to be able to talk about it, but I can't talk about that.
No, fair enough. Fair enough.
I'm very excited for 2021.
Yeah.
That's what I'll say about that.
Okay. So everybody, I guess the gist is, let's pay attention to what Audeze is doing in 2021.
We haven't forgotten about you guys in hi-fi.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because I think that was one of the things, seeing all these other new products coming out, like
gaming and
Yeah,
we don't have the resources to necessarily focus on more than one channel at a time, but we do have overlapping R&D cycles.
Mhm.
So it's not like we're not working on anything. We're always working on lots of new projects. We have lots of ideas and things like that. We have to focus on, of 100 ideas, the 2 or 3 that are going to be marketable, like we can actually bring to
Sure.
market.
Yeah.
But we do a lot of R&D, and we are always working on overlapping product cycles. We've just had a bunch of gaming stuff come out, obviously, and we've had a big push for, music industry, because the LCDX has been, our most successful headphone in 2020, I believe, was our most successful headphone because the pro market needed, work at home gear.
Mhm.
But we have not forgotten our beginnings in hi-fi or our lovely community. So
Last quick question for you. Reveal Plus. Is Reveal Plus something that is so I noticed even just this last year, I think there was an update to Reveal Plus. How do you guys, or how do you imagine Reveal Plus is going to be integrated when there are, various different revisions of Audeze headphones? Does this require Reveal Plus being a little bit more conservative than it might otherwise be, or what's sort of the approach there?
Conservative, like in terms of,
Well, like if it's changing the FR, right? And there are different,
okay.
there are variations on different,
I don't know, because I'm not deeply involved with the development of the software. I know our chief technical officer, our lead engineer is, I'm pretty sure he comes up with the curves, and he's got a complex process of averaging different ones. And, it's compensated for the fact that, headphones should all hit a target curve, but there may be small variations like that. All that kind of complicated stuff is all taken into account. The complexity with that is that it's created by a company called Embody, who does a lot of spatialization and stuff like that.
Okay.
And they are the ones who update Reveal Plus. So we can say, hey, we have new curves, or we have new headphones, or things like that need to get updated. But then they have to actually go and do it, and then send us back, and then we test. And so it's not necessarily like the fastest process in the world. But again, we're not a huge company, so it's like we can't afford to do every piece of complex software development in-house, because we have a small dev team. We have a limited number of folks. I don't know that much about that. That said, I don't know that much about it. I have seen it updated a few times with new headphone models and things like that. I think that's something that's been brought up, though, certainly in our meetings, is like, hey, if there was like a running production change, or if we have a new headphone, or if there's like a retuning of something, for example, like, how are we going to update it? So it's something we're talking about. As always, the struggle is bandwidth, because there's like many hi-fi companies, we have a lot of products. We have a lot of different things. We try to support all of our products as well as we can. But when you have a team of less than 20 people and you have more SKUs than you have people, it's like sometimes, things happen as we give attention to them. So please let us know. I bring all the things that get talked about to me on the Twitch and on, our social channels and whatnot to the team. And we do talk about them. We take them seriously. So, so let us know.
All the comments, we're going to go through those, and we're going to send them. No, I'm just kidding.
Every single one to my personal email address.
Yeah. Well, listen, I know you gotta run here. But thank you so much for doing this and hopping on the live stream. And this was a ton of fun, and I learned a lot. So
Yeah,
So
thanks.
it was awesome
Thanks
to
you
have
guys for having me. I would love to do it again. I had a
Yeah.
ton of fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, your chat is awesome. And also it was great to hang with you. Nice to meet you, Tyler, officially
It's me also.
for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
All right.
yeah.
Well, yeah, we'll cut it there. And yeah, thanks everybody in the chat for tuning in. And I just want to let everybody know we will also be doing another live stream next week. Next week's will be on Thursday again, but it'll be, I think, a little earlier, and it's going to be with Focal. So stay tuned for that. Alrighty.